Christians versus Pharisees, choosing sides and how to fight for them in the Mormon Civil War. Episode 7a, How Mormonism Could Win the 21st Century. Greetings, intrepid listeners. I have prepped and recorded probably 3 more minisodes of episode 6, The Thought Police, with lots of really awesome content. If you loved Hugh B. Brown, you are going to adore John A. Widtsoe. And being bitten by the bite model has been a reality check and a half. But I have decided it's time to get the legendary, but very real, episode 7, How Mormonism Could Win the 21st Century, out into the world. I have tantalised my very patient listeners about it for far too long. Thank you for hanging in there with me and all the amazing and encouraging feedback about this podcast. Over 1,000 people have been downloading its several episodes every week as a podcast or through YouTube, so you are not alone, and I'm genuinely humbled by the response. This episode is all about bringing back the hope that even after being completely realistic and doing due diligence to research and understand the many profound flaws, mistakes, dysfunctions, lies, betrayals, and all-round crazy that has gone on in the formulation and history of Mormonism, there might still be enough left in it that is good when we prove all things, reject the dreck, and only hold fast to that which is good in this wonderful, infuriating and fascinating religion of ours. I envision episode 7 being a 2-parter, and in this part A I will be covering 10 of the things going in our favour, or that we can put front and centre from our theology, with lots of additional commentary and thought about how to work with what we've got in this religion in today's realities as a whole. My bold claim is that if we get Mormonism right, there is no reason we should not still be capable of fulfilling our early idealistic expectations and truly grow exponentially and fill the earth as a new world religion. That we have, like sometimes deeply buried treasures, to use a rather triggering metaphor, exactly what we could put front and centre to meet the needs of the world in the 21st century and beyond, and really be again the forward-thinking, mind-expanding, and revolutionary religion we once were in many ways. But the grim reality is that for too long our leaders have established a dysfunctional system of leadership, control, and decision-making since Brigham Young's coup d'etat at Winter Quarters by the Quorum of the 12 Apostles he was the president of, and his power base, in complete violation of the instructions for our religious government and decision-making by democratic common consent that are canonized in the Doctrine and Covenants. This system has promoted and empowered the very worst kinds of people to lead our church that is meant to change the world by rescuing the world's largest religion, Christianity, from its many flaws and entrenched theological and practical dysfunctions. So before we can have any hope of doing that job properly, it's a case of physician, heal thyself. We have to save ourselves first, have a Mormon Reformation, and then we might have a chance of being capable of helping anyone else do better. Perhaps the example we set over the next few years of making radical reforms could be part of how we show the rest of the Christian world the way to do the same, if we get it right. Or maybe the best we can hope for is that we learn effective strategies from the other Christian denominations that have navigated difficult reforms, and having got ourselves shipshape, it will be the strength of our raw, unique selling point doctrines that convince the rest of the world to consider getting on board the good ship Zion, and not ending up stranded in a shipwreck, hanging on for dear life after a few years or a lifetime sailing with her. If we cannot offer the world a good example of getting things right in a timely manner, the next best thing is to offer ourselves with virtuous humility as an example and a warning of how not to determine who gets power and decides the doctrines, and how we have learnt from our mistakes and reformed those systems and practices. The example of a repentant sinner is always a more powerful and helpful example to set than being a prideful, self-righteous goody two-shoes inaccurately claiming infallibility the whole time. Our cousin Mormons, the Community of Christ, founded by Joseph Smith's wife Emma and their son Joseph Smith Jr. III, quickly reformed to get rid of polygamy and racism in their early years after the Brighamites went in a different direction. Recently, they have made remarkable strides, developing processes for receiving revelation and practicing common consent in a harmonious way, after learning a lot from getting it wrong a few times, as they have grappled with this awesome principle while deciding to ordain women and be LGBTQ inclusive. Two of the most urgent challenges we need to accomplish pronto to have any hope of our young people staying in the church. So we could begin by learning everything we can from their experiences. I'll be talking more about common consent later. The previous episodes of this podcast, and the ones that will follow this episode, document in forensic detail how and why we got into the death spiral we are in now. Why we are ruled by general authorities who are mostly lawyers and businessmen in education, work experience and mindset. The exact categories of people Hugh Nibley warned us in his prophetic BYU Leaders and Managers speech in 1983 are the absolute last categories of people you should ever put in charge of a religion. Exactly as he predicted and warned, they have infiltrated it thoroughly and turned it into a backward-looking, mind and thought infantilizing and controlling cult by pretty much every objective criteria for defining a dangerous mind-controlling personality cult. Not the worst in the world, but when you look at it objectively, really not the best of the harmful mind-controlling personality cults either. We have big problems to be honest with ourselves about, and then solve. This is very hard for typical Latter-day Saints to hear about themselves. We have suffered inaccurate lies and slander in the past from people attacking us for being a cult, and they were often wrong. But the new reality we all need to get our heads around fast is that today, in the 21st century, the most impactful dynamic going on is that the internet and hundreds of qualified, dedicated, and effective researchers have proven beyond any reasonable doubt a mountain of really significant and faith-threatening truths, not half-truths and lies, that our leaders have conspired against us for over a century now to deceive us, to withhold crucial information from us, to secretly rob us of a fortune in tithes and offerings they have piled into purely commercial investments while cutting the budgets we run the church on to the bare bones, so vast it is difficult to even conceptualize, estimated to be around $300 billion and growing exponentially. And now all those cats are out of the bag, they cannot be herded back in. They are all over the internet, and as lifelong church members discover and research them, as often as not, they experience catastrophic loss of trust and leave the church, often along with their families or parts of their families, which puts a huge strain on marriages and other family relationships, never to return. The net result is also catastrophic for the church as an institution. While claiming 16 million members, we are probably down to only 3 million still active and falling. A decade ago, the Apostles' own data was that 80% of our young people leave the church before they reach age 30, and further research indicates what we can all see, that most of them leave in their early teens. In the UK, leaked data shows we are now down to less than 15% of members active, and our congregations and stakes are mostly shrinking. All the other drivers of growth, full-time missionary numbers, convert baptisms per missionary, retention of converts and active members, birth rate, are all in freefall in most areas, including the Deseret heartlands now. My opinion, based on all this data and what we in the UK have learned from watching with our own eyes huge Christian denominations that once seemed unassailable crash whiplash fast into oblivion, is that we have a very brief window of opportunity now, I think 5 years at the most, to enact really radical reforms and rediscover our religion's unique selling points that don't depend on the racism, sexism, homophobia and transphobia and anti-science, anti-intellectualism that the current culture and leadership class in our church have made into the church's number one priorities. Wonderfully, perhaps counterintuitively, Mormonism at its best was always meant to be equipped and proactive at deconstructing and fighting racism, as the Sons of Mosiah and the overall story arc of the Book of Mormon do, leading the way for Christianity to decontaminate itself of toxic patriarchy, with the double whammy of a heavenly mother and Eve as the Christ avatar hero of the Garden of Eden story, not the weak and sexually corrupting villain mainstream Christianity made her into, and with her all women. And if we really embrace the openness to ongoing revelation and learning from all sources, including scientists that I've been tracking leaders like Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, Hugh B. Brown, John A. Widtsoe and others teaching as fundamental to Mormonism, we should be able to listen and learn from LGBTQ people about their lived experiences, and the scientists revealing to us how it is they are born with their sexualities and gender identities. We should and could adapt to these new insights as our very long journey from ignorance to the total knowledge of God continues, and accomplish full LGBTQ inclusion in our religion of reason and free choice autonomy far more easily and painlessly than any other church, rather than being among the last in the Christian world to cope and improve, as we shamefully were regarding racism. The simple reality of the 21st century is that if the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is the last institution or place left in their lives where racism, sexism, homophobia and transphobia are not only tolerated, but proactively celebrated as God's mind and will, when they are rightly regarded as barbaric medieval nightmares by young people and their schools, their workplaces, and society at large. There is no way they are going to touch this religion with a barge pole, much less raise their own children in it. The church leaders have had the foresight to see this crisis and conflict coming for a long time, which doesn't require any kind of special gifts to realise is inevitable, and have chosen to mostly dig their heels in and try to train the church members to hunker down and get used to increasingly being in conflict with the ethical norms of the wider world, and survive as a persecuted people again. None of which is cheerful, but as they see it, we cannot avoid this if we are to be true to our faith. But their fundamental error has been to miss at least two truths. One is that the real Mormon faith isn't their pharisaical and bigoted faith. Christian Mormonism, as I am calling it, is profoundly anti-racist. It is revolutionarily feminist in the Christian context. Doctrine and Covenants 121 powerfully deconstructs oppressive, patriarchal traditions of how power and priesthood are defined and wielded. totally dismantles them, as I will get into in more detail later. The LGBTQ issues are a very thorny matter in a religion that on the surface seems to make heteronormative unions of men and women fundamental to its pathway to exaltation. But before we start any thought process or conversation in Mormonism about that, please allow me to remind you, as a living 21st century Latter-day Saint who in the 21st century, not the 1800s, has been forced against my will into an eternally polygamous marriage by the church authorities and their practices. Latter-day Saint apostles and prophets are the last Christians on earth to have any right whatsoever to be dictating to anyone, including their own church members, that they have a completely worked out and functional grip on what the boundaries and nature of eternal marriages really are. They are still making an utter shambles of their endless flip-flopping of doctrine and policies regarding what constitutes a combination of people in marriage to each other that is acceptable to God. We already have, just in the marriages of Joseph Smith, the founder of our religion and the ultimate source of all the priesthood keys and doctrines we claim are from God, the endlessly vaunted prophet of the Restoration, a mind-boggling variety of marital arrangements apparently approved and authorized and even commanded by God, so assertively he sent an angel waving a threatening sword on fire to intimidate Joseph into doing this stuff. The prophet Joseph's marriages included marrying a 14-year-old girl, marrying 2 women who are sisters, marrying a mother and her daughter, marrying his foster daughter, and 14 of his wives were legally married to other men. So he had 14 brother husbands, as well as the women in the marriages having lots of what they called sister wives. The prophet Joseph did marrying women without the other wives even knowing, marrying women twice, once in secret without his first wife Emma knowing, and then doing it with her there later while pretending it was the first time. He did sending men on missions and marrying their wives while they were gone without informing them. Joseph did all of that, and we still trace the keys and lines of priesthood authority back to him for every saving and temple ordinance and priesthood ordination in our church. Gina Colvin, in her Thoughtful Faith podcast, has pointed out that temple sealings are not actually marriages anyway, when you pay close attention to the wording. So before anyone starts having an opinion about what might be possible for Mormonism to accommodate or authorize doctrinally or ritually regarding same-sex marriage, or declaring that same-sex marriage would break our religion and our church, they need to eat a bakery full of humble pies and reality checks before even beginning to suggest it is a no-no, considering the wild free-for-all of pretty much anything goes we have already sanctified in our religion's catalogue of marital arrangements. Monogamous same-sex marriage really doesn't seem that odd to me if it gets added to that list. The ongoing revelation and learning concept in Mormonism gives us the tools to make radical changes where needed. And no one should forget that not a word is said anywhere in the Book of Mormon, nor, as far as I remember, the Doctrine and Covenants and Pearl of Great Price, or coming from Jesus' mouth in the New Testament regarding LGBTQ people. Christian homophobia and transphobia is mostly down to the attitudes of Paul, who grew up as a Christian-killing fundamentalist Pharisee, so there are some very interesting conversations to be had with that starting point. The second truth the current LDS leadership are forgetting, if they ever understood it in the first place, is that our religion teaches we all have a very long way to go, and a lot that is yet to be revealed, before we get anywhere close to fully understanding all the truth about ourselves and God and what's really going on. We really cannot assume we already know, here and now, that there is no way that same-sex marriages in the temple could be part of the overall game plan of salvation and exaltation in this huge multiverse. Joseph Smith repeatedly taught how essential it is that we do not make the Catholic error of creating creeds and proclamations that fossilize and impose boundaries on our doctrines in such matters, when we have no idea yet what the next revelation might tell us and change. Maybe Joseph Smith's example of being quite relaxed about rewriting and changing his doctrines, rewriting bits of the Book of Mormon even, as his understanding and the flow of revelations grew and evolved over time, shows us the way forward rather than being an embarrassing secret to hide. If we don't make these reforms very soon, in most of the stakes of the Church we will cross thresholds of decline and losing our young people that we will never recover from. Because when the elderly members still hanging in there die, there will be almost no one else left to populate or lead or grow the Church. My generation have already lived through the painfully slow decades it takes to build a Mormon congregation from scratch, when the active church membership was actually growing globally. And after watching the current leaders and the culture they embedded burning that hard-won growth to the ground, there simply aren't words to describe how livid I am with them and the carnage and suffering they have caused to people who trusted them. I am mad as hell, and I'm not going to take it anymore, and nor should any of us, in my opinion. But I also love this religion. So I'm channeling my anger into discovering and encouraging proactive solutions. I think we are still the guardians of something really special that at its best offers hope and a future for religion to be completely comfortable, relevant and useful to people in the modern age, the information age, the age of democracy, the social justice and activism age, the age of the empowered and self-actualizing individual, the actual space age even. We were gifted by whatever actually went on in the Mormon Restoration with the best hope religion has of thriving competently and healthily as this century progresses, from what I've discovered and learnt about so far as a curious human being and a high school teacher of philosophy and politics and world religions, along with my main gig as an art teacher, tasked with inspiring the next generation of humanity with the skills and vision to become imaginative designers and creators of more and better by learning everything they can from the past and believing in a progressive and hopeful future. These are the core values I was taught and nourished by in the Christian Mormonism I was raised in and blessed by, that has always been at war with the Pharisee or Lucifer religion of unquestioning obedience and command and control that kills individuality and creativity and progression, that our religion teaches has been the fundamental dynamic of existence since our premortal life and for eons of multiverses before then. I look at all the world's religions and traditions and philosophies and rejoice that the Christian Mormon God is bigger. His and her ambition for humanity and what we can become is the greatest that is actually possible. To become gods ourselves. Our religion's ability and prime directive to embrace and include in our belief system every truth from every possible source we can learn it from makes ours the ultimate future-proofed ideology in the Christian and possibly the entire religious world, at least on a par with the best of the rest, because it is all about our ongoing journey to learn more and become more. and it is absolutely fearless about being challenged and questioned and tested in what Hugh B. Brown called the marketplace of ideas. Our founding prophets and apostles taught that our response to being proved wrong about anything is not to sulk and run away or panic, as our people and leaders are mostly doing these days, but to rejoice, to thank them for saving us from that particular aspect of our ignorance, and welcome replacing it by something better and truer. And I rejoice that our wacky temple rituals and symbolism, with their really convoluted history, has somehow at least ended up getting one thing totally right. That we wear a symbol over our hearts that represents all of that. That truth is our goal, and that we welcome all truth as part of the whole of our religion. And then I watched someone claiming to be the mouthpiece of God, telling us all that Almighty God only approves of women wearing earrings, not men. But the women should only have one pair of earrings. 2 pairs is too many. And then I watched another man claiming to be the infallible mouthpiece of God, teaching with deadly seriousness in hushed, passive-aggressive tones of sacred holiness, that if your potential wife-girlfriend has rejected the guidance of the Lord's prophet so egregiously that she has decidedeth to have 2 pairs of earrings instead of the divinely approved and prophetically sanctioned 1 pair of earrings, then this is a sure sign that this woman is dangerous, in sinful rebellion against God, and you are not likely to have a secure and trusting temple marriage with her. So it's time to reject her and marry someone else. And then I watch another man claiming to be the mouthpiece of God tell me that the mouthpiece of God that revealed unto us the divine will regarding the gendering and numbering of earrings was actually a servant of Satan, giving him, quote, victories, close quote. And so were we all for a decade, because we obeyed that mouthpiece of God and blasphemed by calling ourselves Mormons cheerfully in social media. And I watch him call upon us to feel truly awful and repent because we offended Jesus and apparently displayed ingratitude for the Saviour's actual atonement. And then I watch him declare that the restoration of the gospel of Jesus Christ is reinvigorated and still happening, with lots more to come under his leadership. And then I watch that same man, claiming to be the mouthpiece of God, announce that he has received a revelation he is going to announce to the world. And it is so important that the timing of when he should declare it has also been revealed to him by Almighty God. So we tune in, eager to find out what this momentous revelation will be to help us as we face a global pandemic and widespread struggle and bereavement and hardship and worry about the long-term impact of it all on our families, our nations and our church. And then I watch this man, claiming to be the mouthpiece of God, proclaim that the revelation is a social media hashtag. The oracle of God tells us that God revealed to him that he wants us to spend the 7 days leading up to American Thanksgiving Day posting every day in our social media feeds something we are grateful for, with the hashtag Give Thanks. And then, as I watch on my Facebook feed, the eager, faithful followers sustain their prophet by doing that every day and having guilt trips if they miss a day. It quickly becomes clear that some church members are not playing ball with this desperately important revelation. Any guesses who? Yes, that would be right. The First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. The most one of them manages is posting their thanks on 4 days. Good try, Dale Renland. 2 of them don't do it at all, and Jeffrey Holland has to be bullied by his social media followers publicly shaming him into producing just one last-minute give thanks post. They can't even be bothered to get the hired underlings who actually write their social media feeds to make sure they practice what the God-man preached. The God-man can't even be bothered to practice what he had us all listen to him preach. And that's just the silly stuff, not even the things they say that drive people to faith crisis or suicide. And I think to myself two things. What the actual Moriankama has gone so horribly wrong in our church? And then, what's the quickest way to replace these people with someone who actually understands our religion and knows what they are doing? These people are incapable of thinking big. These people have forgotten how to think big, if they ever did in the first place. And the totally predictable immediate outcome, since people incapable of thinking big or thinking forward instead of backwards took over our church, has been that millions of people who joined and loved and stuck with this religion because it inspired them to think big, have taken their big thinking with them into the big wide world and left behind the ever-shrinking church that only wants to think small, and has become a self-fulfilling prophecy of relentless decline. So this episode is all about reminding the Mormons how we used to think big, how we can still think big, and how our only hope for survival and then thrival, I made up that word, it's cool, isn't it? Thrival, is to keep thinking bigger and bigger every day until we have a big tent Mormonism that is safe for everyone to participate together in. A big thinking Mormonism that maybe might even deserve to be attractive again to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in exile. The multitudes of inactive and ex-members who still grieve for what they saw the church lose. The gems of goodness and truth and wisdom that they packed up carefully and took with them as they left to keep them safe from the Pharisees who care more about earrings and hemlines and what hand you take the sacrament with than marriages and lives. I would love Mormonism to live up to our ideals and win converts again, this time with honesty, transparency, and full disclosure, instead of half-truths and secrets and lies. Informed consent instead of bamboozled manipulation with rose-tinted fairy tales. We have experimented extensively with pretty much every possible way to get missioning horribly wrong. Let's actually learn from that and start getting it right. And seriously, if our leaders really can't think of how to do that, they have a money pot with more gold in it than the gross domestic product of nearly all of the world's nation-states. They can hire anyone, any number of superlatively gifted experts in their fields to put that together. They can afford anyone. There is absolutely no excuse for our church now to not have the absolute best minds alive on earth beavering away to make all of our manuals, programs and systems not only functional, which would be a first for us in far too many areas, but also world-beating in their effectiveness and excellence. But until that truth actually dawns on them, which it hasn't yet in the 21 years they've spent not a penny of Ensign Peak's tens of billions of dollars on anything whatsoever at all to help the church, I'll get them started for free. The hive mind of the nuanced Mormon and ex-Mormon community will happily tell them for free exactly what they needed to do differently to have kept their trust. Any given classroom of 7-year-olds could tell them how to spend $300 billion and make the world a radically better place. So let's all start talking to each other and get excited and hopeful again. Let's continue to use the miracle of social media to test and refine and spread the very best ideas we can muster to make Mormonism awesome again. Personally, I would love Mormonism to be capable again of converting and keeping people like me, and pretty much everyone I work with each day. People with a basic university education, some common sense, modern values regarding inclusion and rejecting bigotry, and maybe a family. I don't think it's too much to expect for our message and our religion to be able to pass that basic threshold and be relevant and appealing to those people who in the developed world are at least half the population, and who, ironically, we encourage our own Latter-day Saint children to become. This is the craziness of it all. The Jehovah's Witnesses want to keep their people uneducated, poor, and gullible. They specifically disparage or forbid as a pointless waste of time and distraction from their religious duties getting a higher education or even a professional career. Mormons, however, strongly encourage their members to get educational qualifications, to aspire to university and professional careers and stable incomes. But they do everything in their power now to disparage such people who are not members of our church as too rich and too proud to listen to our missionaries. So mostly the missionaries don't even bother with them, and instead primarily target the undereducated and underemployed and gullible, or the desperately socially isolated or recently bereaved, who will jump in the font a couple of weeks after first meeting them, and who teach a religion that doesn't last a day under basic educated scrutiny and half an hour of fact-checking in Google. So instead of raising our game and offering them a Mormonism that is robust and can survive in the marketplace of ideas and basic critical analysis, we demonize the people with the basic skills to think and research as stiff-necked and in the clutches of Satan, and revel in dumbing our religion down even further each year as some kind of badge of honor rather than shameful negligence. We punish non-Mormons for having done what we tell our kids to educationally and professionally, and then we punish our own kids for doing what we have told them to educationally and professionally, for reaching and aspiring for better, and in doing so empowering them to open their eyes and see how shonky the religion they grew up in really is now. So they leave. I would just love to bring my colleagues who are basically like me to church on a Sunday and feel proud instead of toe-curlingly ashamed as they ask me what the hell is going on and why on earth I thought they'd want to be a part of it. I really don't think that's too much to ask, and it's been decades since I felt safe even trying that. I've served as a ward mission leader in 3 different wards. I have seen intimately for years now the full-time missionaries and the way they are told to find and teach investigators, immediately filtering out most of the best of humanity and most of the people on the streets and the towns and the workplaces we live in. It is a miracle that we convert anyone, and that miracle stopped actually happening a decade ago, as we baptize and retain so few converts now. I would like to have 10 different Preach My Gospels for missionaries to teach and discuss from with every kind of person. University-educated intellectuals, Hindus, social justice warriors, drug addicts, disillusioned religious dissidents from other harmful political or faith traditions. This religion should be relevant and helpful, welcoming and inspiring to every kind of child of God. This religion is relevant and helpful, welcoming and inspiring to every kind of child of God when we remember how, really feel it, and can then share that with them. It is not the one-dimensional, one-size-fits-all cardboard cutout of pharisaical tedium the current leadership system and the kinds of people it gives power to have turned LDS Mormonism into. It used to be all about discovering your unique personal gifts and the unique personal plan God has for your life. Now it is all about marching in identical batches, ordained on the same day, in lockstep, along a rigidly prescribed covenant path with exact obedience, entirely modelled on the specific culture, gender roles, and life experience of privileged and isolated white Mormon men in 1950s Utah, who are the current mouthpieces of God and dictators in our church. One of the reasons I'm rushing this episode to publication before finishing the Endless Sixes is that my membership council trial for apostasy for daring to publicly criticise the church leaders is this week. I really don't know which way it will go, and I'm quite excited and curious to find out. The local powers that be putting me on trial insist they have an open mind, so I am allowing myself to be quietly hopeful, while also realistic about what usually goes down at these things. But if this is the last thing I publish in my life as an officially recognised church member, apostates have to have First Presidency approval to have even disfellowshipment lifted, never mind excommunication, so that will never happen. I want it to be this flame of hope, this sparkling jewel from my soul and mind to yours, shining the light of what might have been, and what perhaps still could be, if we are willing to fight for it in the darkness of a rapidly dying and imprisoned religion, being held hostage to everything Jesus warned us never to contaminate ourselves with or tolerate. And if you are one of the many people who will never ever touch this religion with a barge pole ever again after what it did to you and the people you love the most, I want to offer this podcast to you as a healing balm, as a comfort. Not to reconvert you or win you back, but to reassure you after all that you have suffered and how discredited Mormonism has become to you, that you were not stupid to have once loved this religion. We have all been too naive and gullible and easy to manipulate by amateur liars with too much power and no accountability in Mormonism. But we also connected with something profound through it. In many different ways, we reached out and touched the face of God during our time as citizens of this Mormon realm. It may well be, dear listener, that you have rationally concluded with every sensible reason and supernatural instinct to do so that Mormonism is just too tainted to ever trust again. But some of its ideals and big ideas were beautiful, thrilling, exhilarating, hopeful, inspiring, even if only for a while. It has profoundly impacted me how often even the church's bitterest foes have graciously and wistfully acknowledged those moments and feelings and ways of seeing our lives that they still miss sometimes, while understanding that they are simply not taught or possible to experience in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, as it now is in most of its congregations. And of course, a huge percentage of the people who have left Mormonism can never leave it alone, because it is such a fundamental part of who they are and their conditioning as they grew up or made big changes in their lives as converts. It's why they have the family they have. And of course, for multitudes of people who have left, it is still the religion of their family members and friends. It determines everything about how those active Latter-day Saints think of them and speak to them or shun them and their children. It is just there. So they are desperate for this religion or church to be wiser, kinder, safer, better, so that the people they love and live with will become a bit wiser, kinder, safer, and better. Or maybe just the blessed relief of being able to talk about a big idea with their Mormon family and friends, instead of the 1,000 pharisaical tiny ideas about slut-shaming your porn shoulders, or counting your earrings, or rolling their eyes at your hot caffeine as they feed their children a pint and a slice of cold caffeine. In just one of their countless acts of shameless and oblivious hypocrisy, they can't even begin to understand because they are using up all their brain power judging you. It's a big universe. Let's all do more thinking, fellow Mormon humans. There are so many things I love about Mormonism. I'm going to try and trot through them quite briskly, while taking more time on some of the wider-ranging philosophical ones to begin with, because punchy statements of fact or cool ideas don't add up to a religion in isolation. We also need to consider the overall purpose of the things we find important, the joined-up philosophy of Christian Mormonism, and why those ingredients matter in the larger scheme of things. Each could be explored in a podcast alone, and perhaps that will be one way to go with the future episodes of the Mormon Civil War podcast. I'm going to dive into categories like how modern science is now making the weirdest religious ideas credible. So now is the time for Mormons to jump on board science, instead of too many of them still fighting a completely outdated war with it. How Mormonism fixes Christianity's broken dogmas and turns their mentally ill sadist god into a nice one again. How our perplexing temple rituals, with their profound connections to animist initiation traditions, Freemasonry, and the Roman Catholic obsession with praying for dead people to get them out of purgatory, are actually huge strengths to be celebrated and used to build bridges with those cultural and faith traditions rather than embarrassed by them. How we could have been offering people all along the most feminist and anti-racist option in the Christian world, bar none. But let's first celebrate a few of the basic, big ideas Mormonism shares with most religions, and what our religion contributes to those ideas. Cosmology is the science of the origin and development of the universe. Let's get cosmic. 1. Awe at the nature of our existence. We exist! That's freaking awesome! And that realization alone can be mind-blowing. It immediately begs 100 questions that have led to all of human science and all of human religion. Why do we exist? What even are we? Did something make us? What are we meant to be doing with our existence? Is our existence short, or does it somehow continue after our impending death? And looking around us, we exist in a pretty astonishing and amazing, beautiful and perplexing universe. For some reason, pure energy has organized itself into us and everything we see in our garden, in our children's eyes, and through the Hubble telescope, showing us a visible universe of 2 trillion galaxies, and in each galaxy hundreds of billions of stars with habitable planets spinning around them. And just on our planet, life has evolved to take on so many sophisticated, beautiful, interconnected, horrifyingly parasitic and enchanting forms that we are still trying to do justice to its exquisite variety and complexity. And there is something we might call magical in it all, because these life forms don't just eat and poo. They fly, they swim, they hover, they dig, they crawl, they photosynthesize sunlight into sugar, they run, they dance. They create beautiful homes and shells and nests and warrens. They communicate with each other with music and sound and colours and patterns and electricity and chemicals and touch and senses and languages we humans can't even imagine. We should never ever be ashamed to hold space for just being overwhelmed and exhilarated by the mystery and reality of it all, and the forces we could see are at work to give all this energy its rules, its mathematics, its physics, its chemistry, its biology, its psychology. Our religion started in the imagination and awe of a little boy called Joseph, who loved to look at the stars at night and wonder. All religions start that way. The greatest Christian Mormon thinkers at their best, like Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, Orson Hyde, James Talmage, Hugh B. Brown, and John A. Widtsoe, all agreed on and taught one thing, that our religion's purpose is to be eternally curious about it all and hungry for knowledge until we completely understand how it all works, and can then, having finished the job Eve rebooted in the Garden of Eden, acquired the entire knowledge of the gods and become creator gods, making and sustaining new chapters in the endlessly inventive journey and story of evolution and the coming into being of a universe teeming with life forms. The wonderful thing is that we know all this is possible because we can already see it happening all around us. We are a completely embedded part of this unfolding miracle of life. And in Mormonism, some people, pretty much like us, who were once exactly where we are in knowledge and capabilities, made the choice to keep learning more until they learnt how to create all that we see. God is a scientist, a seeker, who learnt and discovered for themselves the secrets and purposes of the universe and of existence. Some contemporary scientists and statisticians living in a world where computer processing and programming and virtual reality are about to take the quantum leap into human-like artificial intelligence as quantum computing catapults us into a completely different league of what is possible to program and make, now seriously suggest that statistically it is far more likely that we and our consciousness and everything we see are all part of a technologically more advanced alien civilization's virtual reality. As usual, science fiction authors and thinkers and filmmakers and Imagineers have worked hard serving the interests of humankind for over a century now by exploring lots of helpful and terrifying possibilities of where that could all lead, to guide us in how to use this kind of power and warn us of how it could be abused. Films and books like The Matrix, Tron, Westworld, Star Trek, the Battlestar Galactica reboot, and countless others have made these mind-bending scientific and technological hypotheses and theories digestible and familiar. Well, if this contemporary scientific theory really is the case, how is that any different really to our religion? A superior, more advanced version of ourselves, who knows more sciencey stuff, creates an artificial or constructed environment differing to our true natures, and plugs us into it as avatars in that virtual world. Immortal spirits made of real stuff following one set of laws of physics, and implanted into temporary mortal avatar bodies following and constrained by other laws of physics in an environment basically determined by God. And there is an overall predetermined story arc with predetermined outcomes, just like a virtual reality computer game with tests and requirements before you can progress to the next level. It is wonderful, or one could of course argue distorting and distracting, that as human civilization reaches each new stage of social and technological development, we revisit old and even ancient familiar ideas and explanations for the world, and they suddenly fit or make more sense to us, which may just be coincidence or might be proving their prophetic nature. Maybe this is how it was always meant to be by God, that as we work through all the intermediate stages of knowledge and understanding on our journey to becoming like God, the very Mormon idea of thinking and choosing for ourselves gives us quite wide-ranging flexibility in how we can imagine, organize, express, and live our religiosity at any given point. The Mormon idea that God is working with all their children and inspiring every religion with some truth seems to support that the precise details of how we think everything should be right now really aren't the most important things. It doesn't break the system to have some individuality and variety along the way as we decide which are the billions of life lessons and insights and data points that God training requires to be getting on with right now. The first encounter I remember with trying to adapt or interpret ancient scriptures and concepts for an ever-changing and modernising humanity was our youth Sunday school teachers, Christian Union at high school, and probably later chats with Seventh-day Adventists on my mission, who were all interpreting wild symbolism in Old Testament prophecies about the last days and the destruction of the earth in Ezekiel and other scriptures, and trying to match them to modern weapons. Spinning wheels of fire became tanks, and other descriptions were interpreted as referring to nuclear weapons in ways that seemed to fit really well. Or they may just have been poetic fantasies or descriptions of very primitive methods of war and destruction from the Bronze Age when they were first written down, or tweaked by the Bible's many re-editors. Today we see this with Apostle Uchtdorf and President Nelson teaching that the seer stone in a dark hat that Joseph Smith translated the Book of Mormon with was no weirder than a smartphone screen that we can see more clearly away from direct sunlight. That all kind of makes sense, while also ignoring glaring differences between seer stones and smartphones, but would have been no help at all as a comforting explanation before smartphones were invented. So maybe the computer simulation universe is a distraction from reality, or maybe it is a brilliant leap forward in our knowledge of what's really going on. But the point is, we will never find out unless we keep thinking about and talking about and researching all those possibilities. This is something that the Mormons of my childhood and youth in the 1970s and 1980s were absolutely brilliant at. Our religion's culture and bookshelves were teeming with wonderful, fervent, and mind-expanding debates and speculation about what it all means. It wasn't all healthy, as you could take any random passage from the vast journals of discourses of the early LDS General Authorities that, along with Bruce R. McConkie's Mormon Doctrine book, that wasn't actually Mormon doctrine, but rather McConkie's doctrine, were the pre-internet Mormon Google. And with those often contradictory quotes, you could make 100 different religions. Speculation became too rife, and too many weird ideas were being fervently taught and testified of as essential to true Mormon faith and belief. So Gordon B. Hinckley clamped down. There was a big Back to Basics campaign in the late 1980s. People were reminded to focus our worship and teaching on Christ. And participating in such forums and publishing could get you punished by having your temple recommend taken away. But in losing all that, we do seem to have thrown the baby out with the bathwater. A lot of the really interesting big ideas that made Mormonism unique and powerful have been forgotten or severely neutered. And perhaps even worse, the whole fundamental idea that our Mormon life should value and include this kind of free and deep thinking speculation, wondering, seeking for more, that is essential if we are to keep progressing forward as a belief system, has pretty much disappeared now and is demonized rather than encouraged by not very informed control freaks who just can't understand it or understand the need for such conversations and seeking. The hunger, as Hugh B. Brown called it in his talks. No progress occurs in science and politics without people doing a lot of blue sky thinking about ideas that may seem crazy at first, but turn out to be genius. I think Joseph Smith's Mormonism is full of blue sky thinking ideas that have turned out to be genius, so perfectly timed and awesome, despite the truly god-awful things he also did and taught, that I am still comfortable calling him a prophet. Not the only prophet of his generation or our modern age, but definitely one of them. So, like science, I really cannot see how our religion is ever going to progress and improve and keep up with the needs of the world it is meant to be blessing, unless we too make it safe to have fearless and sometimes difficult blue sky thinking in our church again. What if the leaders are wrong about this thing? What if we could do much better at that thing? How could we make that really work? What about this obscure idea from the past in Mormonism, whose time to be put front and centre and save us a bit longer has now come? We will never have those conversations while the dominant narrative is that when the leaders speak, the thinking has been done, and the best we can offer in a lesson or sacrament meeting talk is to regurgitate a talk by a general authority in conference that is already mostly made up of quoting other general authorities in conference, quoting general authorities in general conference. That is one tight thought-suppressing vortex of boredom right there. A recent blogonacle thread by people just about ready to give up on this religion after years of being depressed and underwhelmed by that suggested a genius solution. Just have a year where the only talk topics allowed are the parables of Jesus. That would go a long way to rebooting our religion and getting it back on track. These are the kinds of brilliant ideas Mormons come up with when they speak freely and dare to question the status quo. Imagine if we could do that safely on a Sunday or in our ward and state council meetings instead of hidden away in closed groups in social media. We could fix everything fast if we just re-empowered everyone and started tapping into their brilliant hive mind common consent wisdom and experience, instead of expecting some dying men in their 90s who never had much of an imagination to begin with to do it all for us. Meanwhile, the people keen and capable of saving the church are doing it all in exile. We need to open the chapel doors and invite them and their ideas back in. So I'll throw my current pet speculative theory into the mix as an example. Like some other Mormons who still enjoy this kind of ponderizing and have Facebook groups for Mormon scientists, I think Kolob could be a supermassive black hole. Which is part of my next thing to be excited about in Mormonism. Number 2. The Book of Abraham builds a bridge to modern astrophysics. The Book of Abraham and the Pearl of Great Price has received a proper and well-deserved kicking in recent years. The rediscovery decades ago of the original papyri it was allegedly translated by Joseph Smith from has confirmed what Egyptologists have been saying about it for a century, that not a word of the text of the Book of Abraham has anything whatsoever to do with the hieroglyphs on those documents, including the specific ones in the facsimiles Joseph published his translations of in our scriptures. And it turns out the facsimiles themselves were doctored deceptively or had things added, like the head of the allegedly sacrificing priest, to fill in gaps in the very battered scrolls to try and match the Book of Abraham narrative better. Joseph basically lied a lot about how he got the Book of Abraham and the inaccurate performance he put on teaching the school of the prophets how one hieroglyph matches entire passages in the Book of Abraham, as we can see in the ledgers from those classes recently released in the Joseph Smith Papers Project. And the fatal blow that can be delivered to the Book of Abraham that has been there all along, with or without papyri or missing scrolls, is that its first chapter about the origins of the Egyptian civilization is a totally non-credible fantasy that, along with verses in the Book of Moses, makes scripture out of the slave-owning racist folklore that the curse of Cain was a black African skin. It was passed on through his descendants through Ham in Noah's Ark, and the destiny of black people is to be the servants of servants, or slaves of everyone else. But with a huge caveat acknowledging all of that, the thing about the Book of Abraham that really fired my imagination as a nerdy kid was its description of the structure of our galaxy with a real corporeal God in a perfect physical body, living in a world near a star called Kolob, that was so powerful it regulated the experience of time and the orbits of other stars and planets. Just as the Book of Mormon gave me a lifelong amateur respect and fascination with Native American civilizations, These wonderful scriptures made the entirety of astrophysics a legitimate focus of interest and study for us as a religious endeavour. Religion and science should be very close bedfellows. They are both arguably seeking the same thing. They ask really big questions about the nature of our existence and our place within it, and look for explanations that make sense. Since science is now having to radically rewrite itself with each new development from Newtonian physics to Einstein's relativity to quantum physics, and now dark energy and matter in a universe that is exponentially expanding under its influence, instead of collapsing back on itself due to gravity as previously theorized, maybe the unchanging certainties of religions aren't so flaky and unreliable by comparison to science after all, especially if the overall direction of travel of science is increasingly to overlap with, or end up agreeing with, what religions have been saying about the nature of reality all along. To regain any credibility in the modern world, the religions urgently need to get back in the game and engage with contemporary science and see the potential in it all. But most of them are totally unequipped to do so because they have very little to work with in their own scriptures or belief systems, if they even try, compared to the stuff we have to play with in the Restoration scriptures. The overall trend for religions and the leaders who determine their priorities is to double down on their medieval worldviews, taking foggy metaphorical fairy tales like Genesis chapter 1 as literal science manuals, and losing all credibility with educated people who might otherwise be interested in engaging with religions or remaining in them. Religions too often become ragingly hostile to the physical sciences and the medical, psychological, and social sciences, instead of welcoming the knowledge they offer about things like sexuality and gender identity, or the real history of the texts of the Bible, and keeping up. They get left behind, and their backward-looking ignorance screams far louder at people listening to their ideas than the other things they might offer. Anti-academic and anti-intellectual and anti-science propaganda discredits the whole enterprise. And to our shame, the LDS leaders are currently ramping up their propaganda messaging about all of the above, as I've been documenting in this podcast. Tragically, even though Mormonism has actual scriptures about educating ourselves about the sciences and geology and such like, along with plenty of quotes by the founding fathers encouraging the same, during the 20th century, a few very undereducated apostles with Mormon royal family connections, like Joseph Fielding Smith, were given ruling power over our archives, our teaching curriculum, our priesthood, and our theology, and they insisted for decades that it was impossible to believe in evolution and an ancient earth and be considered a faithful Mormon. And factions in the church still believe and teach that today, including President Russell M. Nelson, who is on the record in an interview with the Pew Research Center in May 2007, insisting that evolution is not real, and that, quote, dogs have always been dogs, close quote, even though dogs are one of the most obvious examples of evolution in action that there is. Being a superstar surgeon, which is basically a practical skill being a mechanic of the human body, is clearly not the same thing as being an informed and educated scientist or thinker. The church had Elder Lance B. Wickman of the 70, the LDS Church's General Counsel, or Chief Lawyer, on the call with Rusty because the church is run by lawyers now, and they want someone on hand to save the interview accident-prone apostles from themselves if they do take the risk of exposing them to proper journalists these days. Pew said, "Different denominations deal differently with questions about life's origins and development. Conservative denominations tend to have more trouble with Darwinian evolution. Does the Church have an official position on this topic? Russell Nelson replied, "We believe that God is our creator and that he has created other forms of life. It's interesting to me, drawing on my 40 years' experience as a medical doctor, how similar those species are. We developed open-heart surgery, for example, experimenting on lower animals, simply because the same creator made the human being. We owe a lot to those lower species. But to think that man evolved from one species to another is, to me, incomprehensible." Pugh said, "Why is that?" Russell Nelson said, "Man has always been man. Dogs have always been dogs. Monkeys have always been monkeys. It's just the way genetics works." Oh my gosh. Oh, he's such an idiot. I mean, really. How? How is that even possible? Anyway, Whitman tried to come to the rescue and said, "The scripture describing the Lord as the creator of all of these things says very little about how it was done. I don't know of anybody in the ranks of the First Presidency and the 12 Apostles who has ever spent much time worrying about this matter of evolution." Close quote. Well, that says it all, doesn't it? Evolution used to be discussed intensively by LDS First Presidencies and Apostles up to the 1970s, and the First Presidency even issued an official statement declaring that the Church was not against it doctrinally on the centenary of the publication of Darwin's Origin of Species. But I was never taught that in seminary or institute. And as the chief lawyer said there, the current crop we have running the Church are lawyers and businessmen and a couple of surgeons, and they neither have the intellect, education, curiosity, or common sense to realise they are living in a world where evolution is a certainty, and their religion is not going to survive unless it has intelligent things to say about that. These leaders and their hostility to education and science are contaminating us with the ignorance and discredited reputation that is battering other high-demand fundamentalist Christian denominations and religions. They all held the Church's future hostage and sabotaged it by holding on to outdated worldviews and dogmatic creeds that needed to be abandoned or radically rewritten and improved when further lighter knowledge was discovered and revealed. The tail wagged the dog and is now battering and killing the dog. That apparently didn't evolve. Chihuahuas and cockapoos and King Charles Spaniels apparently used to frolic and hunt in the primordial forests with the Tyrannosaurus rexes in the decades between Eden and Noah's Ark. They turned temporary stages or frameworks of understanding into unchangeable traditions and orthodoxy. They arrogantly believed that they already had all the truth, and it couldn't and wouldn't be improved upon in the following centuries. This is why Joseph Smith repeatedly preached against having any written creeds or articles of faith, because they fossilize incomplete and inadequate assumptions for all time in a religion, and thus prevent further and more advanced revelations from being communicated to us, especially the ones that might require radically changing or abandoning the ideas that ended up being presumptuously carved in stone. Creeds and the idea of unchanging doctrines and practices basically close our minds instead of opening them to receive all that God can teach us. Joseph Smith was very clear that the most important key to receiving revelation was a wide open mind, not exact obedience to Pharisaical rules to make you somehow worthy of them, detached from the intellectual processes of thinking and wondering and hypothesizing. In one of the many amazing letters Joseph Smith wrote from Liberty Jail, in this case to Isaac Galland on the 22nd of March 1839 and published in the Times and Seasons, February 1840, pages 53 to 54, he said, quote, "Mormonism is truth, and every man who embraces it feels himself at liberty to embrace every truth. Consequently, the shackles of superstition, bigotry, ignorance, and priestcraft fall at once from his neck, and his eyes are opened to see the truth, and truth greatly prevails over priestcraft. Mormonism is truth. In other words, the doctrine of the Latter-day Saints is truth. The first and fundamental principle of our holy religion is that we believe that we have a right to embrace all and every item of truth, without limitation, or without being circumscribed or prohibited by the creeds or superstitious notions of men, or by the dominations of one another. When that truth is clearly demonstrated to our minds, and we have the highest degree of evidence of the same." Close quote. He also wrote, as recorded in History of the Church, Volume 5, page 215, "I stated that the most prominent difference in sentiment between the Latter-day Saints and sectarians was that the latter were all circumscribed by some peculiar creed, which deprived its members the privilege of believing anything not contained therein, whereas the Latter-day Saints are ready to believe all true principles that exist, as they are made manifest from time to time." Close quote. And in a sermon on the 15th of October 1843 in Nauvoo, Joseph Smith taught, "I cannot believe in any of the creeds of the different denominations, because they all have some things in them I cannot subscribe to, though all of them have some truth. I want to come up into the presence of God and learn all things. But the creeds set up stakes or limits and say, 'Hitherto shalt thou come, and no further,' which I cannot subscribe to." We can see a parallel to this teaching of his with governmental constitutions in the two nations I am a citizen of, the USA, where I was born, and the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, my parents are from, and where I grew up. The USA has a written constitution cast in ink, inviolable principles for the laws and government of the USA that were written hundreds of years ago by men in a very specific moment in history and social norms. The Constitution of the USA was very far from perfect. It withheld the vote from women and codified human slavery as legitimate and legal. My country's constitution is a wacky hybrid of a hereditary royal monarch as head of state, an appointed or inherited rather than elected revising chamber called the House of Lords in the legislature, and only one elected institution, the legislating House of Commons. The UK Constitution has very old written documents too, particularly the 2015 AD Magna Carta from the Middle Ages that establishes several crucial checks and balances on governmental power and legally enforceable human rights like habeas corpus. How was it then that the British Constitution somehow managed to abolish slavery throughout the British Empire in 1830, but the ungrateful colonial American rebels who regarded the British Constitution and government system as old-fashioned and oppressive compared to their shiny new democratic republic, with government of the white and black people, by the white men, failed to get rid of slavery until the 1860s and only after a nightmarish civil war. In a nutshell, it was because the British constitutional arrangement is an open book, a perpetual work in progress, rapidly responsive to the living electorate. This makes it much easier to just be open to new ideas and reforms, debate them, vote for them, and make them so, without having to tear itself apart arguing about the texts and intentions of the writers of the Magna Carta. We appreciate the Magna Carta. It has its own special room in the British Library in London. I had a look at it last year, along with the oldest surviving complete text of the Bible. But it is not treated as the sacred writ, the be-all and end-all, the defining document of our nation that cannot be amended or expanded without an epic palaver. Mormonism, as Joseph Smith intended it, is meant to be a nimble, forward-thinking religion, capable of changing and adapting to new information rapidly and cheerfully, compared to the clunky religions imprisoned in creeds from the deep past and unable to reform themselves fast enough to keep up with the times and the potential of each new year. That religion, practiced properly, can end racist slavery and empower or ordain black men or women overnight. That religion, practiced properly, can accept the science and radically reform its rhetoric and practices about LGBTQ people overnight, as soon as such things become clearly understood and clearly necessary, not decades too late. But sadly, we don't have that Mormonism in the LDS Church anymore, and the leaders are now scrambling to write proclamations and creeds over months of debate and redrafting in committees and councils, just like we used to condemn the apostate Roman Catholics for doing, and teach, as Dallin Oaks has recently, that this is how God gives revelations to the Church, totally ignoring what has really been claimed about them by all his predecessor apostles and prophets. My jaw just dropped when he taught that in General Conference and his March 2020 Ensign article. There have been lots of attempts to interpret what the Book of Abraham says about cosmology and gravity and so on, and to attribute it to outdated models in Joseph Smith's contemporary scientific milieu, or to connect it with modern relativity and the science of gravity and orbits in spinning spiral galaxies. Here's my take on it. Scientists are now telling us, and for the first time showing us in groundbreaking photographs, that at the centre of most galaxies is a supermassive black hole. A black hole so vast and gravitationally powerful that it anchors an entire galaxy as it voraciously consumes other solar systems and black holes while regulating their orbits with its gravity. Scientists are now telling us that our experience of time slows down the stronger the gravitational field we experience. So as you approach the surface of a black hole, time slows down until it effectively stops. And on the way to that event horizon, what you experience as a day could be the same as 1,000 years further away. And that black holes do not necessarily destroy the information in the world sucked into them, but instead every particle of their nature in a quantum universe is smeared across the surface of the event horizon around a black hole, and theoretically all that information could be extracted again and read or reconstructed, so it becomes like a massive library of information or a time capsule. This Hawking radiation makes the surface of a black hole shine with light and information. Hawking radiation has never been observed, but if it exists, the information lost when objects enter a black hole might be carried out of the black hole via this light. Thus, the information isn't truly lost and becomes immortal, timeless. Bearing all that in mind, now read this in the Book of Abraham, chapter 3. Quote, "And I saw the stars, that they were very great, and that one of them was nearest unto the throne of God. And there were many great ones which were near unto it. And the Lord said unto me, These are the governing ones. And the name of the great one is Kolob, because it is near unto me. For I am the Lord thy God. I have set this one to govern all those which belong to the same order as that upon which thou standest. And the Lord said unto me by the Urim and Thummim, that Kolob was after the manner of the Lord, according to its times and seasons, in the revolutions thereof. That one revolution was a day unto the Lord, after his manner of reckoning, it being 1,000 years according to the time appointed unto that whereon thou standest. This is the reckoning of the Lord's time, according to the reckoning of Kolob. And then in Doctrine and Covenants, section 130, quote, "The angels do not reside on a planet like this earth, but they reside in the presence of God, on a globe like a sea of glass and fire, where all things for their glory are manifest, past, present, and future, and are continually before the Lord. The place where God resides is a great Urim and Thummim. This earth, in its sanctified and immortal state, will be made like unto crystal, and will be a Urim and Thummim to the inhabitants who dwell thereon, whereby all things pertaining to an inferior kingdom, or all kingdoms of a lower order, will be manifest to those who dwell on it, and this earth will be Christ's. Then the white stone mentioned in Revelation 2:17 will become a Urim and Thummim to each individual who receives one, whereby things pertaining to a higher order of kingdoms will be made known, and a white stone is given to each of those who come into the celestial kingdom." Quantum physicists are currently proposing that there are 11 dimensions of space, and when you enter a higher dimension, you can transcend the space-time of the lower ones. Effectively time travel, or physically move around and see everything on it at once, while being invisible to intelligences in it, like us in a three-dimensional consciousness, seeing everything on a two-dimensional surface at once. And that is how our three-dimensional world and space looks to an intelligence existing or conscious in a four-dimensional space, and so on upwards. There is real science now literally saying that this is how it would be possible for, quote, all things pertaining to an inferior kingdom, or all kingdoms of a lower order, will be manifest to those who dwell in a higher kingdom or order. This could all be just as much nonsense as the Book of Abraham's fantasy about arks and racist priesthood bans and the origins of Egypt and its pharaohs. But I find it really fascinating, and at least a new door that Latter-day Saints are gifted to open and explore, in a religion that used to want us to open and explore every door of knowledge possible until we learn to be gods. That's got some value in itself, even if the precise details at the start of that journey turn out to be inaccurate or foggy. That spark of curiosity will eventually get us closer to the truth with each step and experiment. Learning and progression is a journey, so let's at least be moving along that journey instead of ignoring the free way to perfection and remaining stuck in a lay-by, kidding ourselves that we have already arrived, like the LDS apostles, who have decided they already fully understand the eternal truths and have nothing much more to learn or ask God to reveal to us through them, and have already administered to each other in the temple the second anointing ritual, declaring that they have already done and learnt enough to become gods in the next life. What if you are a modern 21st century basically educated person, fascinated by astrophysics and cosmology and science and the vast scale of the universe, and would like a religion that actually makes some sense of it all and attributes a purpose to every part of it, which is much, much more than the generic Christian religion is offering? Common or garden Christians usually respond to the scale of the universe by saying that God wanted to really show off to the humans on the tiny speck of dust that is our planet how great he is, so he made all of that in some ludicrous act of overkill to prove his power to us. If you find that explanation full of galaxy-sized holes, come to Christian Mormonism. We love this stuff. We talk about it, seriously. We have scriptures about it. Quantum physics has been a massive disruptor of most of our assumptions about the nature of everything, in ways that are really challenging to wrap your brain around, and I'm still trying. The discovery of, yet total ignorance about the nature and laws of, dark energy and dark matter have again rebooted a lot of scientific cosmology back to the drawing board in really exciting ways. As our knowledge increases, though, the supernatural and weird are becoming more and more plausible. Which brings me to number 3. Science has now made plausible every key component of a religious reality. This is definitely the time to run screaming back into the arms of contemporary science, not screaming away from it with the flat earthers and Christian fundamentalist young earth creationists who take Genesis literally and insist the earth is only 6,000 years old, and the fossils are a satanic trick, or the Mormon version loads of us were taught growing up that the dinosaur fossils are from other inhabited planets that God recycled this 6,000-year-old one from. In the still ongoing civil war between BYU faculty members and between their students about whether to believe evolution is real or be young earth creationists, Hugh B. Brown said something really poetic and beautiful about this in his 1958 talk, Man and What He May Become, as he taught this fundamental Christian Mormon principle to the BYU students, that true science is true religion, and has as much a place in our religious journey to learn and progress as scriptures do.
Now, if any of you have been bothered about the subject of evolution, I submit here an inspired concept of evolution which exalts man rather than debasing him, and relates both his origin and his destiny to the Creator of all that is. There is evolution, if you wish to have it, to which you can subscribe with absolute safety. But when we speak of man's potential godlike status, let us not forget that the difference between us and our Heavenly Father now is incomprehensibly great, and that concept can only be made tenable in the light of the eternities that lie ahead, and in the understanding and application of eternal progress. Yes, man has a godlike status. We must hunger and thirst for the satisfactions of the soul. In fact, man's nature does hunger. That hunger is gnawing at the mind and spirit of men who are alive. Remember, though, what Wyman said in this search for truth. The greatest enemy of truth is man's tenacity in clinging to unjustified beliefs. You must always be ready to reinterpret your concepts when they fail to pass the test of newfound facts. You must dethrone your prejudices. Someone has said that prejudice is a vagrant opinion without visible means of support. The biblical account of that creation is compressed into a few lines. It's obvious that the Bible was never intended as a textbook on biology, anthropology, geology, or the other sciences. Now, while I've said there's very little said in the Scripture about the creation, I call your attention to this fact, that God is the author of 2 accounts of the creation. One is in the Bible, supplemented by modern revelation, and the other is in the strata of the earth. Now, if you think of it in those terms, you will realize that there cannot be any conflict between those 2 accounts, because they both had the same divine author. Our scriptures, some of them in which we believe, were written by the finger of God on tablets of stone and delivered to Moses. And other scriptures were dictated by him to his prophet scribes. And here, both ancient and modern, and here we have the world's finest literature. But there's no more fascinating story and none more accurate when properly interpreted and understood than the story that is written, also figuratively by the finger of God, on the stony pages of the earth's crust. We cannot determine the exact time that was involved. The earth was organized from existing materials. That you cannot get something from nothing is a scientific as well as a spiritual axiom. But I must not attempt to discuss this matter fully, first because I can't, and secondly because of lack of time. I only hope to leave with you the thought that you are a child of God, and it does not yet appear what you shall be, but what you are to be is largely in your own hands.
As Hugh B. Brown pointed out, evolution is about simple life forms becoming more complex over time and evolving attributes it did not have at the earlier stages. So evolution is a perfect way to describe our personal journeys over a very long period of experiences and learning until we develop all the attributes of God. It shouldn't feel alien to us and our LDS theology at all. What a revolutionary thought! It has profoundly impacted and inspired me. But why was I not taught this as a seminary or university student, and never heard anyone at church say this till coming across this talk, aged 50, when the BYU students heard this from an apostle in 1958. Something really momentous changed and was lost to us all. Humans are not always going to be humans, so why assume dogs have always been dogs, President Nelson? Especially as we do now know how genetics works, and it works wonderfully to bring about organic evolution. And notice that Hugh B. Brown also emphasised the essential importance of Joseph Smith's teaching that we should not hesitate to change and improve our belief system when we discover or have revealed to us further truth, whether from the scientist or the prophet, which he boldly described as equally helpful and important and divinely sanctioned. There is nothing in the Mormonism of these great thinkers, of the current apostles' arrogance and uninformed insistence that only they can be trusted as a source of truth, and the legions of academic experts are all suspect and likely to be wrong if we are seeking more information relevant to our religious beliefs, so there's no point paying much attention to them really. Hugh B. Brown recognised the same wisdom he learnt from Joseph Smith in the ideas of American scientist and philosopher Jeffries Wyman, who he said taught, quote, "The greatest enemy of truth is man's tenacity in clinging to unjustified beliefs. You must always be ready to reinterpret your concepts when they fail to pass the test of newfound facts. You must dethrone your prejudices," close quote. Our religion could be radically reformed and liberated again from its pharisaical and anti-intellectual and anti-scientific chains that are choking it and making the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints a laughingstock. If we could just simply follow this advice from its founder Joseph Smith and its rational faith champion and first presidency member Hugh B. Brown. Our current prophet president may be a respected heart surgeon, but we have already heard that he does not have even the most rudimentary understanding of the most basic biological science of evolution and how genetics works. He thinks that the similarities between humans and the animals he has practiced his surgical skills on are because God made them all and recycled the same body patterns, rather than that they all evolved from shared ancestors, as the fossil record and their genetics prove beyond all reasonable doubt. You might think that doesn't matter in a religion, or if religious leaders are totally ignorant about science. But how is a person that ignorant ever going to understand or believe it when scientists explain to them and his two homophobic lawyer first presidency counsellors how evolution and genetics lead to a significant percentage of people being born intersex, transgender, and homosexual or bisexual? The people they are excluding from their religion and priesthood and temples as they continue their ideological and political campaigns against equal rights and recognition for those people on the basis that their gender identity and sexuality are a choice or a mental illness that must be cured or endured and ignored. And how is it any wonder that Dallin Oaks is still seriously teaching that the Church's 150 years of racist discrimination against people of black African descent was God's will all along, which was entirely founded on the Scriptures and the Pearl of Great Price, teaching that they are the fallen and cursed descendants of Adam's son Cain, if he has not understood the basic evolutionary timeline that the black Africans came first, and the white people are a recent offshoot from them. And if Adam and Eve were real people, all the relevant science is indicating that they were very African and very black. The education and openness to science of our general authorities changes everything and couldn't matter more for the Church's doctrines and destiny. Apostle Neil Anderson, in his April 2018 General Conference talk titled The Prophet of God, referenced a profile of Russell Nelson published in the Ensign magazine in August 1982, titled Russell M. Nelson, A Study in Obedience, which reads, quote, "Obedience to a request from the President of the Church to pray for a people or to study a language is only one facet of Russell M. Nelson's obedience to the maxim, follow the prophet. He is baffled when he hears people ask questions like, is it really the will of the Lord that we do everything that President Kimball says? Quote, the Lord said, whether by my own voice or by the voice of my servants, it is the same, he reminds us. My experience is that once you stop putting question marks behind the prophet's statement and put exclamation points instead, and do it, the blessings just pour. I never ask myself, when does the prophet speak as a prophet and when does he not? My interest has been, how can I be more like him? Close quotes from that article. In his 2018 talk, Elder Anderson praised and celebrated newly ascended President Nelson's example of unquestioning trust and agreement with anything the church leaders say, and urged us all to do the same.
And don't be surprised if at times your personal views are not initially in harmony with the teachings of the Lord's prophet. These are moments of learning, of humility, when we go to our knees in prayer. We walk forward in faith, trusting in God, knowing that with time we will receive more spiritual clarity from our Heavenly Father. One prophet described the incomparable gift of the Savior as the will of the Son being swallowed up in the will of the Father. The surrender of our will to God's will is in fact not surrender at all, but the beginning of a glorious victory. Some will try to overly dissect the prophet's words, struggling to determine what is his prophetic voice and what is his personal opinion. In 1982, 2 years before being called as a general authority, Brother Russell M. Nelson said, I never ask myself, when does the prophet speak as a prophet and when does he not? My interest has been, how can I be more like him? And he added, my philosophy is to stop putting question marks behind the prophet's statements and put exclamation points instead. This is how a humble and spiritual man chose to order his life. Now, 36 years later, he is the Lord's prophet. In my personal life, I have found that as I prayerfully study the words of the prophet of God and carefully, with patience, spiritually align my will with his inspired teachings, my faith in the Lord Jesus Christ always increases. If we choose to set his counsel aside and determine that we know better, our faith suffers and our eternal perspective is clouded. I promise you that as you remain resolute in following the prophet, your faith in the Savior will increase.
The problem was, as mentioned, the prophets like Spencer W. Kimball that Russell Nelson decided to unquestioningly agree with were also uneducated, ignorant, and hostile to science in the anti-evolution and anti-science tradition of Joseph Fielding Smith and Bruce R. McConkie, what is often referred to now as McConkie Mormonism, because it was codified in McConkie's book Mormon Doctrine, that wasn't Mormon doctrine, and quoted intensively in the curriculum my and my parents' generations grew up being taught. And Spencer Kimball was the absolute worst imaginable in what he taught about homosexuality. And so it was that those attitudes are still held in the 21st century by the current president of the church, the man with absolute power and no accountability or common consent scrutiny by the church members, who is primarily responsible for the church's doctrines and political action regarding all kinds of science-informed life or death matters, including abortion, euthanasia, gender identity, and sexuality, even though it seems literally impossible that this could still happen in the information age. Like, has he really not even watched a single convincing documentary about evolution in 96 years? But intense self-censorship by religious fanatics is a thing. I've been taught to do it all my life in the church, and this guy goes for it with enthusiasm. As Neil Anderson pointed out, never seeming to question the leaders has taken him right to the top, because their Pharisee system absolutely values that skill above all others. Except, of course, he has questioned the leaders and threw Presidents Hinckley and Monson under the bus for their I'm a Mormoning while they were still warm in their graves. But that's because the second skill set the Pharisee system values is hypocrisy and doublethink and cognitive dissonance, all symptoms of never engaging in critical analysis and fact-checking. I have mentioned in a previous episode how President Nelson told a medical journal in an interview that he has always refused to even read articles about medical research if the abstract summary of its findings disagrees with what his religion tells him are, quote, eternal truths, close quote, which I can only imagine means anything to do with evolution and genetics, which are crucial to modern medicine and science. And all the members of the church, as we have just heard, are being repeatedly commanded in general conference talk, after face-to-face, after devotional, after interview, by most of the general authorities to be similarly detached from all the insight, information, and common sense that science and academic research would otherwise give them. Suddenly, the lack of basic scientific knowledge of the Church's current prophets and apostles, and so many of their followers following their example and doing exactly as they are told, gets very serious and impacts thousands of LGBTQ people's lives. Not just among the Church membership, but all the people in secular society impacted by the social attitudes and discriminatory laws these religious leaders have championed and funded, cheered on by their followers taught to totally agree with them and trust them to always be right, and never question them or fact-check. And many of them have experienced appalling depression or committed suicide because of what these ignorant men have taught as the absolute truth about them, the mind and will of God. 18 of the 20 or so LGBTQ Latter-day Saints I know and love personally have had to leave the church for their own safety and mental and spiritual health. The cost of these ignorant prejudices Hugh B. Brown taught us decades ago, and Joseph Smith taught us 2 centuries ago, that we shouldn't hesitate to, quote, dethrone, close quote, because they are, quote, vagrant opinions without visible means of support, close quote, has been catastrophic for the individual people and their families they have thrown under the bus, and the church as a whole. So one of the most amazing and transformative things the LDS Church could do to save itself and stop literally killing its own children is to remember that for generations LDS leaders already gave them permission to trust the scientists and respond and update our doctrines and policies accordingly. The current LDS leadership's futile and self-sabotaging war with modernity and science was entirely unnecessary and avoidable all along. I own thousands of books and adore them, but as a busy high school teacher, very rarely get time to read any of them, so I've had a lot of my significant aha moments while consuming TV documentaries. British television is copiously blessed with huge amounts of documentaries that are simply wonderful. One of the best for me and my religious journey was a documentary I saw sometime in the 1990s and am still trying to track down again. It was basically saying that quantum physics is now so weird and theoretical, and revealing a reality of existence totally unrelated to what we think is going on from our everyday observations of Newtonian laws of physics like gravity and electromagnetism, that we have now come full circle and re-entered the realm of the alchemists, the medieval researchers who were pioneering science with a worldview that was a complete hybrid of superstitious, occult and religious ideas with early processes and discoveries in chemistry. In their world, the physical and the spiritual were intertwined. Their laboratory experiments messing around with chemicals and transforming materials from one state to another were accompanied by spells and chants and timed in conjunction with the seasons and the zodiac, before the seemingly miraculous processes of science completely disentangled themselves from the mumbo-jumbo and stood alone. In a time before the Hadron Colliders and CERN were actually proving the existence of theoretical particles like the Higgs boson or God particle while atom smashing. In the 1990s, a lot of this science had not yet been proved by empirical or observable experiments. And the scientific community was basically saying, you need to believe us, without much evidence that our models for matter and physical laws are real, like a religious faith. This really got me excited, as science was no longer the done deal, the finished project where pretty much everything to understand and explain was understood and explained, and it definitely didn't have room in it for spirits and heavens and all the crucial cosmology of religion. Those were just metaphors, not observable reality, and religion, to be rational, needed to surrender and admit defeat. It was quite embarrassing to hold on to those religious ideas and places as real, while the trend in human scientific research seemed to be relentlessly disproving them. Now the game has completely changed. The scientists are excited, but also incredibly frustrated and a bit embarrassed to admit loads of their previous models turned out to be nonsense or very incomplete, and that only a tiny percentage of all the matter in the universe even follows the Newtonian laws, because it is mostly made up of what they are calling dark energy and dark matter, while having almost no clue what they are, just that they are there and they hold the fabric of the universe together. This eventually led to me creating a PowerPoint to blow my young religious education students' minds and get them excited that their generation still has epic scientific discoveries to make, which I called What science has to be true for religion to be true? I identified the key physical realities that had to be present or possible for the main components of religions and their gods to actually be real. They are omnipotence. Gods are all-powerful, with the power to create the universe and life forms from nothing in some religions. As well as making the universe in the first place, gods use their power to keep it all running in an organised way, following rules and laws and holding energy together in all its different forms. They can also intervene to battle enemies and make miracles happen, or heal and rescue people. They can control the behaviour of physical things with their minds. Omniscience. Knowing everything that is going on everywhere in the universe at once. Omnipresence. Being physically present in some way in every part of the universe. God or God's power, control or influence is everywhere, but we cannot usually see God. Living organisms, particularly humans, have a soul or spirit or Atman or ghost. It is part of their life force, which is usually invisible, is interconnected with their visible physical body, making it alive, and can continue living before or after our physical three-dimensional body that we can detect and touch and see has been born or died. Souls are usually believed to be immortal. They will never die. In most religions, souls are real, but exist in a different dimension and follow different laws of physics to our physical bodies that are born, live, and die. There are different places for living things, their spirits, gods, and other good or evil spirits to live in. They sometimes interact with the world we are consciously aware of. Intelligent and spiritual beings can travel between these worlds. They might be called heaven, hell, the spirit world, other planes or dimensions of reality. And finally, time travel or transcendence. For a god to know the future and tell prophets what to prophesy about the future, they have to be able to see or be physically present in the past, present, and future all at once. For most of human history, there was no scientific basis for any of those things. Then, starting in the 1900s, science took some completely unexpected twists and turns. The Newtonian clockwork universe is turning out to be far, far weirder than anyone suspected, and the extraordinary and mind-bending discoveries are still happening now. While they don't specifically prove that traditional religious concepts about God, the universe, and our existence are true, they have started to offer lots of different ways that they could be scientifically possible. The rules of the long conflict or competition or fractious relationship between religious beliefs and science have been reset, and we are once again dancing on the same stage. According to the scientists, there was indeed a moment of creation where everything seemed to be made out of nothing or something close to nothing. The entire universe, which today has 2 trillion galaxies with hundreds of billions of solar systems in each galaxy, exploded 13.8 billion years ago from an infinitely dense and infinitely hot point of energy smaller than an atom, when the matter and antimatter in it became slightly unbalanced towards matter for some reason. Scientists call this point a singularity. As it released its superhot energy, the space and time of our universe was created. Because time is a fourth dimension of space, as proven by Einstein, there was no time before this space was created, which is how scientists answer the question of what was there before the Big Bang. If there was no time, then there was no before the Big Bang. As the energy expanded, it started to become different forces or subatomic particles. and eventually protons, neutrons, and electrons, which made the first element atoms, hydrogen, later helium and lithium, and over cycles of supernovae and new star creation, heavier and heavier elements with more electrons each time were created. Other versions of the theory suggest maybe we live in a multiverse, and new universes are created by big bangs that happen when other universes bang into each other, or that singularities are created in a black hole in another universe. We might be living in a black hole's fart. This all supports the concept of an omnipotent creator of universes who seems able to create all of existence as we understand it from nothing, or from something, in a single moment. Multi-dimensional space. Time is a physical dimension of space, the fourth dimension according to Einstein, and Stephen Hawking and other physicists working on string theory currently work with the M-theory version, which suggests there have to be 11 dimensions of space to explain everything they can see and calculate in the known universe. In each dimension, the laws of physics are different, and if you can be aware of or exist in a higher level dimension, then you can physically move around outside time and three-dimensional space to look in on them wherever you choose. This makes possible the religious idea that we have souls with different laws of physics existing and interacting with our mortal bodies from dimensions of space that are invisible to us. And it provides more than enough dimensions of space for heavens and hells and kingdoms of spiritual domains. Most of our religions don't even need 11 of them, and some theories of how our conscious mind functions involve quantum physics processes, and dipping into some of these other dimensions of space to make it all work, which parallels the idea that we experience our souls, our true selves, in our conscious minds. The double-slit experiment is one of the easier ways to prove this weirdness is real. Light seems to behave both as particles we call photons travelling in straight lines and as waves of energy at the same time, or depending on how you measure it. When you fire individual photons of light at a wall through a board with two slits in it, the photons seem to travel through both slits at once, as a quantum wave being present in more than one place at once. But if you use scientific instruments to detect the photon as it travels to the wall, it physically resolves itself into one photon particle and only travels through one of the slits instead of both. This is clear proof of mind over matter. The matter of the photon physically behaves differently because a human or even mechanical mind is observing it. Google that. The double-slit experiment is truly amazing. Magic is real. Quantum entanglement. Every part of the universe may be connected or entangled with every other part of the universe, and information can be communicated between them instantly, much faster than the speed of light, which Einstein said is the fastest speed that anything can move, because all the universe was created at the same time in the same place, in the singularity that triggered the Big Bang. This opens a door wide to omniscience, being aware of or having information communicated from any part of the vast universe to any other part of it, or from the mind of a god to all the rest of it. Dark matter and dark energy are incredibly powerful components of the universe that make up possibly more than 90% of everything there is. They hold the fabric of the universe together and enable creation and everything to happen, but are completely invisible to us at the moment. They may actually fill everything we observe as empty space. This is exactly how many religions and their scriptures describe God or God's power, including our own. So pick up the cool sciencey bits of the Book of Abraham and a website of the photos taken by the Hubble telescope and start to engage with the scientists where they are at now. Those verses and other things Joseph Smith taught also offer us and the world, number 4, a robust answer to the age-old philosophical problem of evil. The problem of evil is basically the conundrum that if God is so loving and good, and God made us, and everything, and all the rules of blessing and punishment he judges and blesses and punishes us by, then God becomes completely ethically responsible for all the sin and suffering in the world. It's entirely his responsibility. So if God is the kind, loving God the Christians like to believe he is, why does he allow sin and pain and suffering and threaten eternal negative consequences if we don't follow his rules? Why didn't he just make us all to be safe and happy and deserving of nice outcomes for eternity if it was all up to him to decide what the laws of our existence would be? Mormonism grabs this intractable problem by the scruff of the neck and sorts it out lickety-split. I really first came across this idea while working part-time in my Chichester University library to earn the train fare home every weekend to serve in the 4 callings I had in my home ward as a young student. I think they included teaching gospel doctrine and possibly being Sunday school president or ward mission leader and a stake YSA rep or some kind of combo like that. My university student body was a really quirky combination of artists and performing artists, sports scientists, elementary school teachers in training, and theologians, so the library was equally diverse. I came across a book called Crisis of Moral Authority, The Dethronement of Christianity by Cambridge theologian Don Cupitt, first published in 1972. As a returned missionary from the very dysfunctional Christianity of America's Bible Belt, I was never going to resist a book title like Crisis of Moral Authority, The Dethronement of Christianity. In it, Don Cupitt basically destroys the credibility of the traditional Christian God, and suggests the only credible future for Christianity is as a kind of social justice movement detached from God being anything other than a metaphor. It's very simple. If God made us all ex nihilo, from nothing, we didn't exist at all in any form until God created us the way we are, and then trapped us in this ruthless Hunger Games scenario of our mortal lives on earth, where if we don't play by his arbitrary rules exactly as he demands, he will torture us for eternity in hellfire. So why on earth, with his divine foreknowledge of the future, did he make from scratch the people that he knew all along would end up being tortured in hellfire eternally? The traditional Christian God is a really sick sadist. A monster. Someone we should have absolutely nothing to do with and never worship. As I read this book, something life-changing dawned on me. Joseph Smith already fixed that mess. Not only in the Mormon doctrine that everyone will get a completely fair chance at salvation and a good immortality, and that even the less lovely options for the intentionally wicked are still degrees of glory, not circles of hell, although we could debate that one another time. Not only in Joseph's teaching that the only people cut off from God in misery are the people who use their free will to absolutely insist that they don't want saving. Our free will is the prime directive that constrains even God. We are all free to choose. But also in that weird doctrine I was aware of, but found a little too odd and redundant to really bother with. The doctrine that we are co-eternal with God. That our intelligence, our unique, personal spark of light and truth, that gods usher into spirit bodies for the next stage of their life cycle, has always existed for all eternity, going backwards as well as forwards. It was not created ex nihilo. God is not the author of the universe and its laws and ethics. The universe just is. The nature of existence has to be this way. It is the only way that works, or at least the only way that works in our universe. Intelligent beings become gods by learning about the universe from the universe and other sentient beings who already went on that journey of learning through all eternity. What eternity means and how we experience time is a big mind-bender for another day, both scientifically and religiously, and perhaps we will one day transcend time and space ourselves and fully understand it. But basically, the weird Mormon idea that there isn't only one God in existence, but that godding is a career you can aspire and progress to, and the multiverse is teeming with gods and goddesses who learn the tricks of the trade and become those kinds of guys and gals. Their intelligences always existed with the potential to become what they are now, and so did ours. So, crucially, in Mormonism, God is not the sick sadist. He didn't make us, and he did not make the rules we are all playing by. He is not personally, ethically responsible for every sin anyone ever commits, or for there being inevitable karmic consequences of our choices. Mormonism offers Don Cupid and everyone like him their credible, loving, real God back. I think that is by far the most important and potentially world-changing doctrine Joseph ever taught. The implications change everything and literally save Christianity, the world's biggest religion, from its fatal kryptonite, against which it has no defense. And guess what? I still have that book. It's typical of my life that I can't remember how. Either in a second-hand bookshop or an online eBay order, I found and bought an old copy of Crisis of Moral Authority, many years after first discovering it in the library. When I opened it up, it still had a library label in it from our Bognor Regis campus where the theology students were based before the library was consolidated in Chichester. This was the actual book I found and read all those years ago at college. The three Nephites have been really busy helping me with my shopping. There must be an Ensign article in that somewhere. As well as our co-eternality with God, in 2 Nephi, the prophet Lehi backs this up by teaching how even God is subject to immutable laws of reality and the universe, and if he does not stick to them, he cannot be God, because divine power cannot function any other way. He cannot make up or change the rules on a whim, or as he sees fit to this week. Quote, "And if these things are not, there is no God. And if there is no God, we are not, neither the earth, for there could have been no creation of things, neither to act nor to be acted upon. Wherefore all things must have vanished away." Close quote. Don't ever let anyone get away with telling you that there is no significant or original theology in the Book of Mormon and Joseph Smith copied it all from other sources he came across or heard about. There is plenty that could have been plagiarized or just was from the King James Bible, but not all of it. The Mormon God is consistent and rational and thus reliable. He fully detaches from the pagan pantheistic gods of powerful beings with very human emotions and biases and wrathful vengeance, who make us and change the rules for humanity depending on how they are feeling today. And we have no right to question them when they are being unjust. An idea that has slipped into mainstream Christianity as the get out of ethical responsibility free card they deploy when asked why God lets bad things happen to good people, or has in many of their doctrines already predetermined who to save and who to throw into hell. Their answer is usually, we can't understand God's mind and will in all things because he is so much more intelligent and wise than we are, so just accept it and assume there are good reasons. Sadly, this rather rubbish excuse for continuing to teach and trust an obviously unethical God who keeps hurting people is still alive and kicking in Pharisee Mormonism, when apostles dodge reasonable questions and challenges to their more messed up policies and revelations, like 150 years of institutional racist segregation, or the November 2015 policy of exclusion, by insisting that the prophet sees things we can't possibly see or understand, and it is all for a wise purpose. So treat him as infallible, and just trust him. But obviously don't expect him to actually tell us the unfathomable thing he sees, or explain it to us in plain and precious language we can understand, which is meant surely to be his actual job description, and what we are paying him $140,000 a year plus many expenses to do. Pharisee Mormons do that with prophets. Christians play that responsibility dodging game with God. All of this brings us to number 5. Our scriptures about metaphysics intentionally cross the boundary into physics. True science really is true religion in the Book of Mormon. Let's go back to 2 Nephi chapter 2 from verse 11. It might help if you put on some hippie sitar music and assume the lotus position. Are you ready? Then we shall begin. For it must needs be that there is an opposition in all things. If not so, my firstborn in the wilderness, righteousness could not be brought to pass, neither wickedness, neither holiness nor misery, neither good nor bad. Wherefore all things must needs be a compound in one. Wherefore, if it should be one body, it must needs remain as dead, having no life, neither death, nor corruption, nor incorruption, happiness, nor misery, neither sense, nor insensibility. Wherefore it must needs have been created for a thing of naught. Wherefore there would have been no purpose in the end of its creation. Wherefore this thing must needs destroy the wisdom of God and his eternal purposes, and also the power and the mercy and the justice of God. And if these things are not, there is no God. And if there be no God, we are not, neither the earth, for there could have been no creation of things, neither to act nor to be acted upon. Wherefore all things must have vanished away. Wherefore the Lord gave unto man that he should act for himself. Wherefore man could not act for himself, save it should be that he was enticed by one or the other. Adam fell that men might be, and men are that they might have joy. And the Messiah cometh in the fullness of time, that he may redeem the children of men from the fall. And because that they are redeemed from the fall, they have become free for ever, knowing good from evil, to act for themselves, and not to be acted upon, save it be by the punishment of the law at the great and last day, according to the commandments which God hath given. Wherefore men are free according to the flesh, and all things are given them which are expedient unto them. And they are free to choose liberty and eternal life through the great mediator of all men, or to choose captivity and death, according to the captivity and power of the devil. For he seeketh that all men might be miserable like unto himself. Close quote. There is a lot to tease out there, but a couple of things that jump out for me are this idea of the binary opposites, the yin and the yang, as fundamental to reality and the ethical nature of the universe and its components, the ever-present options and choices we make about good and evil. Several religious traditions, particularly the Eastern ones from Asia, like Hinduism and its child Buddhism, are all about recognizing and embracing these aspects of reality and seeing them as something in a balance or harmony. And now physicists are telling us the fabric of the universe literally is constructed of competing or connected or balanced opposites, such as matter and antimatter, the gravity that pulls things together and the dark energy that pulls them apart from each other to expand, the supersymmetry of subatomic particles and their shadow particles, the binary code of ones and zeros. Another way Mormon scripture encourages joined-up thinking and shared methodologies between religion and science is number 6 on the list of Mormon awesomeness with which to win the 21st century. The Book of Mormon in Alma 32 teaches us to use the actual scientific method to grow a religious testimony. This absolutely blows my mind. I could not love it more, and it is a perfect way for our religion to be credible in the 21st century and beyond. Joseph Smith was living in a world that had just experienced the Age of Enlightenment. Science had finally got going as its own thing, disentangled from superstition, and established the concept of requiring evidence, proof, and rational analysis and interpretation of that evidence before trusting or believing something as true. This has seemed to many totally incompatible with the traditional Christian way of viewing coming to religious belief as primarily a supernatural experience and process, a miraculous divine intervention. The Book of Mormon has plenty of supernatural, miraculous divine interventions in people's lives in the traditional biblical way, arguably at times simply plagiarized almost word for word from the Bible, like Alma the Younger's Road to Damascus encounter with Christ as he went about persecuting the church, that totally parallels Paul's in the New Testament. But it also has this. The scientific method for determining what seems most likely to be true involves asking a question or having an idea to try out. First, you research everything you can about a topic and that has already been discovered or thought by other people about it. Then you form a hypothesis, a potential explanation for why something is the way it is or does what it does. This might be a hypothesis you thought of yourself, or one that is being suggested to you as an explanation by another person or by a religion. You then devise an experiment, something in real experience, to try and experience and observe, that should help provide supporting evidence for the hypothesis if it is onto something true. You conduct the experiment or observation, and then you review the results that were observed and the data that has given you. Next, you try to reach some conclusions about the hypothesis from the experimental or observed data. If the evidence seems to be backing up the hypothesis and proving it, you start to call the hypothesis a theory. One of the greatest linguistic tragedies of our age is that in popular culture, the word theory has become thought of as what scientists call a hypothesis, just an idea without evidence to prove it. Lazy Christians regularly dismiss the theory of evolution based on this linguistic misunderstanding. They say, it's only a theory, they haven't proven it's true. The theory of evolution is actually one of the scientific concepts that has the most supporting evidence, but scientists sensibly avoid talking about it being a fact because they have the experience and humility to understand that they may have it all wrong, and new discoveries in the future may prove some of today's assumptions about things to be incomplete or inaccurate. So instead of asserting they know things to be infallible absolute truths, like fundamentalist religions do too often about too many of their current beliefs that will later prove to be wrong, they moderate their certainty with that caveat. But that doesn't mean it's 50-50. the theory of evolution is more like 99% certain based on all the evidence so far. Its credibility is not unsupported or hanging in the balance. So the scientists always exercise caution. The most they will commit to is, quote, the evidence and analyses of the evidence we have so far seems to be strongly supporting this hypothesis. But we need to do more experiments and more analysis of lots of other things to steadily grow our knowledge about this matter towards greater certainty. It is simply being realistic about the spectrum of certainties and how much evidence there is to support different theories about the reality we all experience. Bearing in mind all of that, have a listen to this from Alma 32. Quote, "And now, as I said concerning faith, faith is not to have a perfect knowledge of things. Therefore, if ye have faith, ye hope for things which are not seen, which are true. And now, behold, I say unto you, and I would that ye should remember, that God is merciful unto all who believe on his name. Therefore he desireth, in the first place, that ye should believe, yea, even on his word. Now, as I said concerning faith, that it was not a perfect knowledge, even so it is with my words. Ye cannot know of their surety at first unto perfection, any more than faith is a perfect knowledge. But behold, if ye will awaken and arouse your faculties, even to an experiment upon my words, and exercise a particle of faith, yea, even if ye can no more than desire to believe, let this desire work in you, even until ye believe in a manner that ye can give place for a portion of my words. Now we will compare the word unto a seed. Now if ye give place, that the seed may be planted in your heart, behold, if it be a true seed, or a good seed, if ye do not cast it out by your unbelief, that ye will resist the Spirit of the Lord, behold, it will begin to swell within your breasts. And when you feel these swelling motions, ye will begin to say within yourself, it must needs be that this is a good seed, or that the word is good, for it beginneth to enlarge my soul. Yea, it beginneth to enlighten my understanding. Yea, it beginneth to be delicious to me. And now, would this not increase your faith? I say unto you, yea. Nevertheless, it hath not grown up to a perfect knowledge. And now behold, because ye have tried the experiment and planted the seed, and it swelleth and sprouteth and beginneth to grow, ye must needs know that the seed is good. And now behold, is your knowledge perfect? Yea, your knowledge is perfect in that thing. And your faith is dormant, and this because you know. For ye know that the word hath swelled your soul, and ye also know that it hath sprouted up, that your understanding doth begin to be enlightened, and your mind doth begin to expand. O then, is this not real? I say unto you, yea, because it is light, and whatsoever is light is good, because it is discernible. Therefore ye must know that it is good. And now behold, after ye have tasted this light, is your knowledge perfect? Behold, I say unto you, nay. Close quote. It's the scientific method, with all its sensible, cautious caveats about not overclaiming, and how knowledge grows in stages, and we can only be certain about a few things, and there is always more to know, but also adventurous possibilities. It's a rational faith. It's the introduction to religious belief that modern, rational, scientific people cannot reject out of hand because it involves a process they already trust. It is a wonderful companion to other scriptures about how we can judge things by their consequences or the fruits they produce in our lives, and how doing the word or putting into practice the teachings of Jesus enables them to prove themselves to us to be true and wise. Number 7. Mormonism has a cosmology and purpose for our existence that has far more in common with the Eastern religions than mainstream Christianity does. If Christianity is truly to become the one true global religion, The biggest nut it has to crack still is Asia, and its religions based on mostly very different foundational truths to the aggressive, proselyting, we have the only truth, competitive, patriarchal, fighting religions of the three religions of the Bible: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, and other faiths believe that we all have a soul, or Atman, that it is an eternally existing fragment of divine being and truth, a spark of life like the Mormon concept of eternal intelligences. Atmans reincarnate for lifetime after lifetime with the purpose of eventually learning how to become gods and achieve enlightenment or moksha, and rejoin the collective divine consciousness, bringing with them everything they have learnt from all those lived lives. This has really big parallels with the Mormon plan of salvation and exaltation to divinity, where our purpose is also to live intensively in mortal life on this planet as an educational experience, rather than mainstream Christianity's cock-up Plan B inflicted on us by some flaky lady bamboozled in a garden by a talking snake, and totally sabotaging God's plan for the universe and all his children. And then, when we have learned enough, we also ascend to rejoin the collective hive mind of what Mormons call the Council of the Gods, the benevolent Borg, who guided and advised our heavenly parents when they were planning the creation of our world. So Mormonism, properly understood and communicated, should be able to connect respectfully with and build on and learn from Eastern religions in ways that mainstream Christians cannot even begin to get their heads around. These doctrines are our passports to be players in the East. I first discovered this while having fascinating conversations with devotees of Theosophist Krishnamurti and Eckankar at university, and found that our common language was in the esoteric bits of Doctrine and Covenants 93 about the nature of God and light and truth. And I now thoroughly enjoy living and teaching in a town teeming with Sikhs from the Punjab in India, and my deep conversations with my proper philosophical hippie Sikh colleague Satwinder Singh. One of the many comforts that gives me is that he reminds me that all religions are struggling with the same civil war between living up to the foundational ideals of our religions against factions and leaders determined to screw it up and turn it into an oppressive and judgmental and uninclusive system of strict observances. And what Dieter Uchtdorf called in his October 2015 General Conference talk, "It Works Wonderfully," quote, man-made good ideas, programs and expectations that end up crushing the flower of the true gospel we started with. We can learn a lot from the internal politics and power struggles of other faiths to help us strategize and win our own. Other bridges of empathy and common ground we can build with totally different religions that Mormon or other Christians struggle to construct are to be found in the experience and concepts around the temple endowment. Number 8. In the temple, we also go fully animist and Catholic. All the original religions of the world seem to have been, and often still are, what scholars call animist. Animism is a religion usually found in primitive tribal societies that still function as extended family groups, rather than scaling up to nation-state size, although Japan has managed to retain its animist religion of Shinto and similar traditions all the way to empire level. Animism basically believes that non-human animals and sacred places are inhabited or animated by spirits, often the guardian spirits or hostile spirits of your own ancestors. They need to be kept happy and visited in their world to heal the sick by your community's spiritually gifted shaman or witch doctor or whatever you call them, in dance or chanting or drug-induced trance states and sacrificial offerings. In animist cultures, it is usual to induct boys and girls into the religious practices, social laws, and status of adulthood by taking them out of normal life for a few days or weeks, and in a sacred space in nature or a sacred building, to induct them into the details and secrets of their tribal law. Often this involves performances by sacred characters representing good and evil and creation myths, acted out in full costume, and sometimes joining in this immersive theatre as participants themselves. The initiation rituals might also involve marking their bodies with symbols, with paint or tattoos, or something more drastic like scarring or circumcision. Echoes of these ancient traditions persisted in Europe in mummers' plays and passion plays, where ordinary local people take on the different roles, and these eventually evolved into the rituals and storytelling participatory performances of Freemasonry that Joseph Smith and the Mormon founding fathers were inducted into in Nauvoo. Just a few months later, they repurposed the rituals and philosophy the Masons taught them as the much less convoluted and elaborate, but nonetheless very weird and different to what Mormons are used to, temple endowment ceremonies and storytelling about the creation of the world by the gods, and how Adam and Eve and Lucifer brought about in the Garden of Eden the fall upwards to learning and potential godhood. The concept is basically exactly the same as the amazing initiation lodges of the many cultures of Papua New Guinea. The Mormon initiation ritual, which we call initiatories, involves placing 4 symbols permanently on our bodies in the form of the symbols sewn into our garments, our second skins, we are required to wear for the rest of our lives. It might actually be less hassle to get tattoos. And like our temples, the focus in those sacred spaces is often on remembering and communicating with, or somehow serving the needs of our deceased ancestors. We also, in our vicarious prayers and rituals to release the spirits of our dead ancestors from the Mormon purgatory called spirit prison, absolutely channel the prayers and rituals and masses for the dead and prayers to dead saints of Catholicism that we usually find completely alien. Outside the temple, Mormonism in its meeting styles and extremely simple sacrament and baptism rituals with 0 smells and bells usually resembles extreme Puritanism in the firmly Protestant traditions of Christianity. But in the temples, we unleash our inner Catholicism with glee. We have far more in common with them than we like to think, after decades disparaging Catholics as the great and abominable church, the whore of Babylon, like Mormon prophets and revelators did in the good old days. It's time for some humility and more of that bridge building. I think my awesome great-aunt Queenie, the Catholic nun in the Sisters of the Poor, who I am so glad I met a couple of times as a rather sheltered Mormon boy, even though everything about her seemed completely alien to me at the time, would approve. Number 9. Mormonism's Freemasonry connections might be a good thing. When the Latter-day Saints doing the research go down the rabbit hole of discovering just how much the allegedly eternal and unchanging and very Mormon rituals, handshakes and symbols of the temple endowment and its clothing and garments directly plagiarise from Freemasonry, this is usually regarded as a catastrophe. A terribly embarrassing and damning indictment of how much we've been lied to. And all the traditional fears about Freemasons as some kind of weird occult conspiracy tend to come into play. Let's consider flipping that script. Once we get our heads around Joseph Smith being what Terrell Givens calls an inspired eclectic syncretist, somebody who gathers together great ideas from all kinds of places and puts them together in our religion in innovative and groundbreaking ways, which can also be seen as just an excuse for a lot of stealing other people's ideas and pretending God told them to you, of course. It is worth spending a bit of time actually researching Freemasonry and what it is all about. This journey for me began when I baptized a Baptist Freemason on my mission in Alabama, and the branch president of the next Mormon congregation over in Alabama was also a Freemason. I'd never heard of Mormon Freemasons before, and he was quite open about the many similarities between the Masonic handshakes and tokens and the temple endowment. More recently, I've become good friends with a Mormon Freemason who lives in Utah, who has introduced me to a fascinating subculture of Freemasons who love Mormonism because of the big ideas it's assimilated from Freemasonry. They see these as some of our greatest strengths, but worry as I do that they are being seriously threatened as the leadership keeps changing the endowments to end live participation, destroy the original fabric and arts of the Salt Lake City Temple, and play down the big ideas in Mormon theology that have Masonic roots or connections. I also have two friends I grew up with who have left the LDS Church and found a significant sense of community and purpose that was then missing from their lives by joining Masonic lodges and continuing their journeys of spiritual enlightenment and positive charitable social action through those organisations. Masonry was still surrounded by mystery and secrecy and the whiff of corruption when I was growing up. But a couple of years ago, the British Freemasons decided to end the secrecy and open the doors to documentary makers and their cameras, who followed several of their members on their journey with Masonry and demystified it a lot. In a nutshell, the big ideas Freemasonry gave Mormonism are the idea of transcending religious and cultural barriers, to gather truth and wisdom from lots of sources, and unite around shared ethical and spiritual values as people from any faith can be Freemasons. The idea that we are all here to be lifelong learners and progress and grow in the depth of our philosophical understanding in harmony with being good citizens and living a life of community service and social responsibility. And also the idea that our destiny is to ascend to become priests and kings and perhaps even gods. It's time to make peace with our Masonic brothers and beliefs and make the effort to understand them rather than fearing them, because just as Freemasonry inspired many of the movements for democracy, such as the founding fathers of the American Revolution during the Age of Enlightenment, arguably its influence on us has also been a force for good, in enhancing and perhaps inspiring many of Mormonism's most elevating and mind-expanding big ideas. Several very knowledgeable Mormon Masons have been working for years on a book they are hoping to publish soon about the whole history of Masonry in Mormonism that will be called Method Infinite: Freemasonry and the Mormon Restoration, by Cheryl L. Bruno, Joe Steve Swick III, and Nicholas S. Litursky. So look out for that when it is finally published. Number 10. Mormonism embraces the real timeline of the history and development of civilization. One of the trickiest things modern Christians have to grapple with is having a lot of their key beliefs and moral values, particularly towards LGBTQ people, determined and codified by warring desert tribes in the Middle East from the actual Bronze Age. Most of Christianity exists with a love-hate and somewhat dysfunctional relationship between the Old Testament and the New Testament in the Christian Bible. It often characterizes the gods of each as being very different to each other. New Testament God is a woke, tree-hugging hippie in sandals, transcending traditional boundaries to empower the downtrodden. Old Testament God is a ruthless, vengeful, genocidal maniac who does the downtreading. He wiped out nearly all of the world's human and animal population in a global flood during an epic drop, and kept telling his prophets to lead wars of conquest, slaughtering every man, woman and child of their enemies, and punishing them if they showed any mercy. Islam's Sharia law is basically a reboot of the laws of Moses in the Old Testament, and Christians who find it too alien and threatening as a legal system always have the nagging truth speaking at the back of their minds that it all came from the Bible they share with the Muslims. In a nomadic culture, discipline and consequences for crimes had to be short, sharp and effective, with an emphasis on rapid reconciliation between perpetrators and victims and their families, because there aren't any prisons for a 10-year jail sentence in a caravan of camels. Western Christian culture often recoils in horror at Sharia law, and this feeds into Islamophobia. But like the Old Testament laws of Moses, it has a lot more going on of restorative justice than people realise, and much lower recidivism rates than they have managed in their systems of crime and punishment. So maybe the Old Testament God wasn't quite as barbaric as he seems. Joseph Smith's Mormonism boldly acknowledges and embraces this reality of a very different Bronze Age God to the Christian one by framing God's interactions with humankind through history as a series of dispensations, starting with the prehistoric tribal patriarchs and ritual systems involving lots of animal sacrifice you can do at home, then scaling up as human civilization developed to nation-state level by having Abraham born in the cradle of modern civilization in the Sumerian culture that was the first to create writing as far as we know. As other cultures fired up to literate nation-state and empire level like the Egyptians and Babylonians, so the religion scaled up to something much more elaborate and sophisticated in the form of the laws of Moses and associated tabernacle and temple-focused worship and power structures. The next step was the Roman Empire, the largest in history at the time, which established the rule of law and safe travel across vast swathes of the civilized world, from Britain to North Africa and the borders of India. As soon as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, was established on the back of slavery and a terrifying military, the main event occurred, and God became man as Jesus of Nazareth. The religion he introduced abandoned the oppressive rules and rituals and observances of the laws of Moses and the Pharisees, who had made them even stricter, and empowered individuals from every nation, kindred, tongue and people to take his gospel across the world and become a global religion, guided by basic principles and the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, rather than long lists of rules about how to do the washing up and what you can eat or touch. Mormons then kind of ignore the next 2,000 years, although we are starting to talk a lot more about the Protestant Reformation as being the work of God. And our restoration for the final iteration of the Judeo-Christian Islamic religion occurs, according to our usual narrative, at the earliest sensible opportunity of the modern era, the Industrial Revolution, just after the scientific and ideological revolution of the Enlightenment, and in a country dedicated to religious freedom. As a British citizen, I must point out at this moment that the narrative in the church that the USA was the only place in the world with the religious freedom for the Restoration to occur is total nonsense and needs to stop. Stop it. Europe was a civilized place with the rule of law by the 1800s in ways that huge swathes of the United States of America failed to accomplish till much later. It is highly unlikely that Joseph Smith would have been murdered in Britain for his beliefs, or even his polygamizing at the time, by a vigilante mob while he was in police custody. America's much vaunted by Mormons religious rights and freedoms did nothing to protect the founder prophet of our religion from being slaughtered while in legal custody. And in the years after that, the Mormons had to literally flee the United States of America to Mexico to escape persecution and genocide. So one of the things we definitely need to drop from Mormon rhetoric is the totally inaccurate American exceptionalism nonsense that the Restoration could only have happened safely there, and they were and are the only truly free nation on the earth. I refer you to my earlier statements about how Britain managed to abolish slavery throughout its international empire decades before the allegedly superior Americans managed it. Ungrateful colonials. Anyway, back to the main point here, that Mormonism is realistic, apart from that, about history and civilization. It copes robustly with a God who cannot run faster in guiding humanity than the civilizations he is interacting with can cope with. Our salvation and progression really is a collaborative effort. Many critics of religion see this as a fundamental weakness. If God is so almighty and all-powerful, why does he let human cultural limitations hold him back? And why did God spend so many verses in the Bible stipulating how to manage your slaves and how rape victims should marry their rapists? Yet at no point anywhere, even to the Restoration prophets, did Almighty God mention anything about germ theory and how they should really boil their water before drinking it. That would have saved billions of people from disease and early death. What exactly are the divine priorities here? So of course it seems very obvious, looking at things objectively like this, that God is an invention of mankind, and often made in the image of where mankind's technology and social values are at every given moment, rather than humans being really stretched to make radical improvements by an interventionist God. This is a very thorny issue, and I'm not going to go into it in depth here, but simply acknowledge and celebrate that Mormonism at least makes an effort to make sense of this reality in its highly developed teaching and thinking about how much our salvation is a collaborative effort with God and intentional. Particularly in the larger context of the truth that the major difference between generic Christianity and Mormonism is that Christianity only needs you to know that Jesus died for your sins, accept him as your saviour, and try to be nice to people as the world goes to hell in a handbasket. The journey of history and the past and the future are all basically irrelevant, and we are just waiting for Jesus to come back and snuff out this whole Plan B mistake we should never have been in the first place, and whisk us off to a blissful heaven where we can just sing to him all day for eternity. Unless he's decided to burn us alive forever in fire and sulphur. Lovely chap. The entire purpose of our existence in Mormonism is utterly different. The atonement and the salvation it offers us is a starting point to get us through our infancy. As soon as we can stand on our own 2 feet, our job is to learn and learn and learn for ourselves everything we need to become creator gods. God cannot do that for us. He doesn't sweep in on a rescue mission like the atonement for our sins and just do all the hard work so we don't have to. It's a foundational Mormon principle that you cannot progress any faster than you gain knowledge, and that knowledge can only be gained through experience and seeking it. You gotta wanna, as one of the deeper LDS youth slogans said. One of my favourite words in biblical scholarship is epignosis, the Greek for knowledge gained through experience. That one word really sums up the big idea of the Mormon plan of salvation. It turns us into proactive seekers of knowledge and co-workers with a loving parent God pointing us in the right direction, but not really making it very easy because we need to toughen up and we need to learn to walk by ourselves as we progress. I am absolutely inspired, humbled, thrilled, and motivated by this doctrine. For all its goodness and strengths, I see nothing in mainstream Christianity that even begins to compete with this. This is why Mormonism is where I am planted, even though it has become so catastrophically dysfunctional and disappointing in recent years. This is why I don't want to leave it, and I don't want to start a new church to compete with it. I believe it has the secrets of the universe, or at least quite a lot of them, that are severely lacking from other religious traditions. So I am 100% committed to encouraging the reforms we will need to make to get us back to where we should be and could be, instead of continuing to tolerate this amateur shambles that is frittering away everything we have suffered and sacrificed and worked so hard for all our lives. We often have convoluted debates about how awful it is that other Christians don't believe we have the same God as them and won't in many cases consider us to be Christians. How about we just tell them to rack off? Because we don't want anything to do with their sick, sadist God, who brings people into existence out of nothing who he knows he's going to be torturing later, who is offering nothing more to his faithful than to become his living Spotify mix track, singing background music at full volume to drown out the screams of everyone's grannies being tortured in fire and brimstone downstairs from the ant farm he keeps them in, while he twiddles his thumbs with nothing much else to do, and lacks the wherewithal and imagination for maybe elevating us to become everything he is, like a real parent would. We don't need to be in their club. It is a dead end, and even their best case scenario sounds more like hell than heaven. Yes, let's build homeless shelters together and play nicely, but there is no need whatsoever for Mormons to keep holding on to our self-defeating and ingrained inferiority and persecution complex. Our leaders have made far too many catastrophic errors in their desperation to be seen as the friends and equals and co-religionists of the other Christian leaders, while offering them none whatsoever of the ecumenical respect and recognition and legitimizing of their ordinances that Mormons bizarrely and hypocritically complain they won't recognize in our priesthood and our baptisms. We really, really do not need what those people are offering, or to distort and sabotage ourselves trying in vain to fit in with them or get their approval. Let's just own who we are again. Stand tall as unapologetic Mormons who don't need to compromise our doctrines to fit in with the Christian churches with their baby baptizing and the mummified pieces of dead people in their altars, and their sick sadist Jesus, and their cannibalistic transubstantiation. Let's call out to what is left of their congregations to come over to ours, because we are a truer and safer place to live and worship. But first, of course, we have to get our own house in order and be that truer and safer place for them and their families to worship. In criticising the Christian heaven of the captive choir, I want to fully acknowledge that we have our own mess in this area to sort out too. Telling women that their eternal destiny is to be constantly pregnant, popping out spirit babies like some kind of alien queen bee, while the men do all the important stuff, and that they will never get mentioned or prayed to once the kids leave home to go down to their planet, sounds exactly as dysfunctional as being forever infantilized as a musical item in the Christian God's heaven. In the second, and I'm reasonably confident, final instalment of Episode 7, How Mormonism Could Win the 21st Century, I will finish my list of Mormon awesomeness. This first section of the list has been quite philosophical and looking at larger concepts because, as I said earlier, a religion has to be more than a list of data points and individual good ideas. I hope I've shown how Mormonism has more than enough robust, philosophical, big ideas to hold its own on the world stage, a significant package of theology to offer, and the potential to play with the big boys in our own right, not just as a tiny fringe expression of Christianity. And that we should be ready to take on anything whatsoever in the amazing developments in scientific knowledge about what we are, where we are, and what we are made of, and include them in our religion, rather than pretending they aren't there and telling our members to distrust or ignore them. These days, any time I mention LDS theology, I hear the voice of Gina Colvin in my brain shouting at me that Mormonism, or at least LDS Mormonism, doesn't have any theology. Gina is the amazing New Zealand Maori feminist Mormon dissident who I first heard about when her wonderful nephew told me about her while he was serving a mission in my ward. One thing led to another, and eventually I was blogging for the Rational Faith blog, and Gina invited me on some episodes of her awesome A Thoughtful Faith podcast, and unleashed this monster on you all. Gina, in my opinion, is simply a genius, and one of the most important and powerful and wise voices in the Mormon world, because she combines fierce passion and wisdom about the lived spiritual journey we are all on, and how theology and doctrine and practices help or hinder her favourite phrase, our spiritual formation. She is an academic who has studied theology at university level, and her personal journey has taken her from LDS Mormonism to Anglicanism and now the Community of Christ, the name the reorganised Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has now, as she shares my passion and fascination for all things Mormon despite its dysfunctions, and cannot entirely walk away from it. And she does all that while shepherding a brood of teenage boys with her active LDS husband Nathan, and supporting them on their diverse journeys through each of these faith traditions. And regarding theology, in one sense, Gina is right. Christianity has spent 2,000 years developing a huge body of debate and research and thinking and publishing about every aspect of Christian theology. Mormonism has almost diddly-squat of the same calibre, and its greatest thinkers have published at a much less academically advanced level on the whole, with a few noble exceptions like Terrell Givens's book By the Hand of Mormon and Richard Bushman's Rough Stone Rolling, and even those are intended for a somewhat wider audience than just other scholars, and I'm sure I'm missing a few. Which is kind of the point. If most of us have never heard of them, they aren't contributing much to mainstream Mormon thought. Or are not allowed to by the thought police, of course. But in my opinion, the absolute astonishing genius of Joseph Smith, and the Mormon thinkers who have been gardening ever since with the seeds he sowed, is that he somehow instinctively saw the gaping holes in the theological or doctrinal or whatever you want to call them structures of mainstream Christianity's system for explaining our existence and what God is and what God wants of us. And then he simply fixed them, without needing to study the contents of the Vatican Library or know what Thomas Aquinas in the Dark Ages and his own Danish contemporary Kierkegaard thought and said to understand what really matters and makes sense and create robust theology. And he delivered the solutions not in lengthy theological tomes written in the language of academia, but in some really powerful sermons and stories, either written as scripture or spoken as just a few paragraphs in a sermon like the King Follett Discourse. Sometimes a great and simple idea only needs a simple explanation. And in making his theology digestible and accessible in this way, following the example of Jesus of Nazareth, who taught peasants the secrets of the moral universe with simple stories and actions and catchphrases, and launched the most popular religion in the history of the world, Joseph fired up the imaginations, minds and religious fervour of an extraordinary community of people who I think are worth making the effort to help save and reform so that they can make it to the end of this century, instead of disappearing as a brief footnote in religious history. Joseph worked out that the Christian God is an arbitrary sadist, as he listened to different denominations' preachers and studied with Baptists and Methodists and Presbyterians and their doctrines of predestination and getting saved. Like the primary children I have taught over the years, he just asked the obvious questions that adults tangled up in theology forget how to ask. If baptism is essential to get into heaven, what about the dead people or the living people who never even get offered a Christian baptism? Do they just go to hell? If God made us, who made God? As one of my genius primary students asked. And unlike any other Christian denomination, I was able to give her a sensible answer thanks to Joseph Smith. Why are there bullies? As one of my genius primary students asked, getting right to the heart of the philosophical problem of evil. Why does God let bad things and bad people happen to good people? If accepting Jesus as your saviour is a process, a choice that has to be made intentionally and freely, why do most of the Christians of the world baptise babies? Why has Christianity ended up so fractured and divided and disagreeing between denominations about almost every matter of doctrine and practice and authority and ordinances and interpreting scriptures, until they have become bitter foes and so different to each other? They can't all be right or led by the same God, surely. If God loves all his children everywhere in the world, why do Christians think he has only given wisdom and revelations and scripture to one tribe in one continent? What about all the other people in the other countries and islands of the sea? Has he spoken just as clearly to them? If not, why not? If he has, where are their scriptures? How can we learn from what they say? Why is the universe so vast, with so many stars and galaxies and planets? Is this really the only inhabited world? Are there people living on the moon, or the sun, or Alpha Centauri? Would Almighty God really let his entire work and glory be derailed by some naked hippies talking to snakes, and unleash his wrath on all of us, and trap us in a nightmare of sin and suffering? Or is there actually some higher purpose that means all of this is Plan A and always has been? And so the list of obvious questions and obvious confusions in the Christian world and its theology goes on. Despite all their millennia of experience and opportunities to sort them out, and libraries of intelligent thought and research, still they don't seem to get any closer to answering the obvious questions, or agreeing on what the answers are. Joseph fixed them all. You may not agree with his solutions, but he came up with solutions that on the whole make plenty of sense to me, or at least hold their own with the incredibly flaky nonsense that is all that some 1,500-year-old Christian churches have managed to come up with as answers so far. Joseph's genius was to see the big picture and then fix the broken machine of Christianity, after identifying where the faults lie as a skillful mechanic of ideas. Whether those solutions came to him as direct revelation from God, or the Given's eclectic syncretism, borrowing solutions where he could find them in other churches and Freemasonry and novels, or both. It kind of mostly works. And this is what drew well-read Christians and even experienced ministers to become his followers and apostles. And as I've argued, there is plenty in there that is unique to him, and how he thought and what he contributed as new solutions. The Enlightenment requirement for science, for evidence, for reason, for things to make sense to us here and now, rather than making a distracting false idol of mystery, and God being unfathomable and inscrutable, and thus forever distant from us, is the golden thread woven through all of his Mormonism, that makes it entirely modern and potentially future-proofed in ways other Christian denominations are completely unequipped to. In his desperation for the story of our religion to connect intimately with real civilizations and real history, Joseph really overstepped and blundered at times, as we can see in the mess he made of the Book of Abraham, trying to replicate whatever voodoo went on to create the astonishing Book of Mormon, which is far from perfect, but a much tougher nut to crack or explain away. His brain and imagination and instincts and emotions were all just constantly fizzing and overflowing with ideas and challenges and crises. He ended up burning out and exploding like the last and biggest firework on bonfire night. It is our responsibility and opportunity, with some hindsight and epignosis, the knowledge we have gained from the experience of trying to form and live a religion from his ideas, to sift through all the wonders he showed us as he blazed through the religious sky, and the ashes and embers of the things he set fire to and burnt to the ground for good and bad, to filter and choose the treasures to pick up and dust off and work with, and the mistakes and distractions to leave behind. I am furious with Joseph Smith for all the lies he told, how he excused and normalised lying by our leaders, and the betrayals and cruelties he inflicted on people close to him and generations of Mormons since. I'm furious with the LDS apostles and prophets who chose to continue his tradition of telling a lot of lies to cover up and hide from us his mistakes. But even in that awful mess, somehow, an astonishing religion with ideas that are inclusive, empowering, intelligent, and elevating of every person and our potential also emerged, that has been an inspiration and gift to me all my life. I know now that I've lived as long as he did, that I couldn't do what he did and get so much right amongst all the mistakes. Any of us in that situation would have made a massive mess of it, however much we got right, and it is unfair to compare him as a prophet living out his whole life in the very well-documented modern age with religious founders and characters in scriptures, including Jesus, whose stories and the stories told about them we cannot fact-check at all, and who we can only access through third or 2056th hand accounts, heavily censored and committed to paper years after they actually lived. The things Joseph got right, even under that kind of reality checking and scrutiny, especially theologically, are astonishing and deserve respect and reverence, in my opinion. That does not mean, however, that we should ignore the wrongs he did and pretend they don't matter, and just,
for now, give Brother Joseph a break,
as Apostle Anderson and others have famously told us to, while refusing to be fully honest or apologise for the things we need to give him a break for. Joseph Smith wasn't just a typical man of his times. For the standards of his times, he was a professional deceiver, a seer-stone-wielding occult trickster, making money from manipulating people's greed for buried silver and gold and their superstitious beliefs. A menace to society. He was a lying adulterer with an unhealthy sexual obsession with teenage girls much younger than him, and exercising power over other men by marrying and bedding their wives and daughters. But he had amazing charismatic and leadership gifts, and the imagination and compassion to also channel a message of justice and forgiveness and hope for everyone. He was as good as any of us and as wicked as any of us are, and arguably far better and more religiously gifted than most of us. and also far more wicked than most of us. And within it all, he taught the solution for dealing with the things he got wrong. He taught that we are all on a very long journey that will regularly require radical rearrangements of our practices and paradigms, and even what we consider to be scripture. He did not claim to be perfect, and in the text of the Book of Mormon was very realistic about the inherent limitations of making scripture, with the human interference of a limited vocabulary and the practical challenges of editing written narratives. So he empowered all of us to be our own thinkers, our own prophets, seers and revelators, to decide for ourselves what to believe and trust. He and his successors have given us 6 robust tools to use before accepting something as a divine truth. Number 1. Does it make rational sense? Use your intelligent mind and think about it, investigate it, ponder it, research it, and reach your own conclusions. Number 2. Does it feel right? Use your emotional intelligence to judge whether it is coming from a place of Christ-like compassion and love and justice and mercy. 3. Do the canonized scriptures offer support for this thing being true? The scriptures represent the collective wisdom and epignosis of generations of religious people. It is the gift and message from our ancestors in the deep past. They have authority and connect us with the shared community of the ancestors, the departed saints, as the Catholics would call it, their hive mind. Number 4. Do you have a divine spiritual witness that this is from God and true? However God communicates with you, have you experienced that regarding this belief or situation? Number 5. Apostolic authority and consensus. Do the majority of the Church's apostles teach this thing? Have they reached consensus on this matter? Or is it just 1 or 2 of them running with their personal ideas and preaching them alone, or bullying the other apostles into supporting them when they really aren't so sure? I would add a subcategory to this. Are they even authorized apostles or prophets? Doctrine and Covenants, section 20, verse 65 simply says, "No person is to be ordained to any office in this church where there is a regularly organized branch of the same, without the vote of that church." All of our first presidencies for generations, probably since winter quarters, and several of our apostles today, like Geoffrey Holland, were ordained in secret by other apostles months before the membership of the church were permitted to vote to sustain or oppose their appointment to those incredibly important roles and priesthood key-holding authority. So technically they aren't general authorities at all. Number 6. The laws of common consent. Has this doctrine or policy or decision impacting the lives of the saints been presented to the entire membership for an authorizing or opposing vote? If not, we are under no obligation whatsoever to respect them as authorized by God or even by the Church. The last time this was done was 1978, a year before I was baptized as an 8-year-old. So if you disagree with anything they have authorized or proclaimed or policyized since then, you can totally ignore it. Hurrah! Each of these 6 tools on their own have flaws. Scriptures can be interpreted lots of ways. Spiritual witnesses can turn out to be manipulated emotions or elevation emotion. Our rational analysis skills may be a bit shonky, but it is totally reasonable and legitimate in our doctrine to expect anything we are going to take seriously to pass all 6 tests, and together they make a very robust system to aid our free will and free choice judgments about what to believe and do as Latter-day Saints. We are not powerless. We do not need to leave our brains in a bucket at the chapel doors and let the leaders do all the thinking for us and just agree with them about everything. especially as they contradict themselves and each other constantly. So trying to identify a coherent religion teaching one truth in that mess will just lead you to confusion and mental illness. There is lots more to get to as I list the wonderful strengths and treasures with which Mormonism could win the 21st century, including how Mormonism was meant to be spectacularly feminist and anti-racist all along, instead of falling flat on its face on both counts, and how our religion could provide everything today's young people are saying clearly that they expect and insist upon in any religion or action group they are going to commit time and energy to. The LDS Church is sitting on a dragon's hoard of doctrinal treasures and experience, creating close-knit and sometimes very loving and effective communities in the modern world, with an amateur and to some extent inclusive clergy, as well as the hundreds of billions of dollars of shares and commercial property deeds. So it's time we dusted them all off, finished forming them properly, and brought them out into the light of day again, instead of pretending they aren't there and we don't remember them. As episode 7 part A draws to a close, let's recap those first 10 ingredients I have suggested to include in the recipe for Mormonism to win the 21st century with, and actually be relevant, helpful, and attractive to every culture in every corner of the world. Or as our scriptures keep insisting with their wonderful global vision for our God's work with all of humanity, every kindred, tongue, and people. Number 1. Awe at the nature of our existence. 2. The Book of Abraham builds a bridge to modern astrophysics. 3. Science has now made plausible every key component of a religious reality. 4. A robust answer to the age-old philosophical problem of evil. 5. Our scriptures about metaphysics intentionally cross the boundary into physics. True science really is true religion in the Book of Mormon. Number 6. The Book of Mormon in Alma 32 teaches us to use the actual scientific method to grow a religious testimony. 7. Mormonism has a cosmology and purpose for our existence that has far more in common with the Eastern religions than mainstream Christianity does. 8. In the temple we go fully animist and Catholic. 9. Mormonism's Freemasonry connections are a good thing. And 10. Mormonism embraces the real timeline of the history and development of human civilization. This religion was made to be triumphantly filling the world we live in now, by playing to our many unique strengths, not driving off a cliff without them. When I was told as a teenager to prepare for every ward becoming a stake by the time people my age were stepping up to become the church's leaders, I believed them, and I still do. We could have accomplished that. We should have accomplished that. Easily. We baptized and gave birth to more than enough people to accomplish that. The predictions sociologists made in the 1980s of our religion becoming 50 million strong and continuing to grow exponentially from there by the middle of the 21st century, it turns out we're not ambitiously stretching the data or based on exponentially increasing our convert baptism rates. It was mainly based on simply having most of our own children stay in the religion as they grew up. That's how fast we could have grown by now. But our leaders screwed up epically. They embraced the Pharisee religion in every possible way and drove most of our children and most of our converts and most of our older members away. In my country, there are now more than 8 people who have left the church for every person still participating. Globally, in LDS Mormonism, 80% of our own children raised in the religion leave it by age 30 now. We can do much, much better. Let's do better, and maybe respond to that great wisdom and catchphrase from a brave woman who, like Emma Smith, has also been locked in a really challenging and intimate relationship with an alpha male leader who is notorious for rampant womanizing and who many people insist has no redeeming qualities whatsoever, including me. Emeritus First Lady Melania Trump.
Be best.
Let's be best, Mormon people. Being an amateur shambles and decades behind the ethics and arc of history on everything that really matters totally sucks, and it isn't working. And if the LDS Church authorities drag you into a court of love and threaten you with excommunication for trying to
be best,
be strong, look them in the eye, shame them with the truth, and wear a sparkly apostasy hat with colourful feathers in it with pride. Truth always prevails.